Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 250 of our regular shows, and we are recording this one on August 13th, 2022. This is the official podcast for the fan site, AvatarTheLastAirbenderOnline.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, on this show, we are going to be doing some news at the start. We've got a few interesting topics here, but then our main topic will be the third of three of our kind of review podcasts for the Dawn of Yangchen. So we're going to be reviewing the final third of the book, chapter 28, all the way up to the end of the book. So pretty notable show here, of course, episode 250 as well. Of the regular shows, we obviously have way more than that when you factor in all the other ones, but still, it's a somewhat notable number. But yeah, we'll jump in with the news here, and we'll start with, we have the August update for the Avatar Legends role-playing game Kickstarter. So this one is kind of mostly positive, but obviously like it still doesn't really feature that much sort of clarification on when stuff is actually coming. They just say that the printing is on schedule. It's not done yet, but they're on schedule. Nothing is further delayed than it was last time out. They are saying all of the accessories have been shipped out and they should be receiving them soon. And I guess they are beginning to think about the whole, shipping stuff out to backers. That's where the next sort of stage of the process. They are basically saying next update they should have, I guess, an actual shipping date. So that will be when they're going to fully lock down like everyone's addresses and stuff like that. But that's really where that is. And then beyond that, they're just saying that in terms of the PDF being available to purchase for people who didn't back the Kickstarter, so just purchasing it, that will be tied to when the physical stuff begins to ship out, which they do say later this year, which I guess sort of confirms that the stuff, they are expecting to ship the stuff out this year. And then they say that All-Star Actual Play is nearly edited. That will be sent out to backers soon-ish. And Virtual Tabletop is still in development, and they don't really have anything to say right now. So the kind of printing update is basically sort of the same as before, but getting towards the end. It's just slightly better than before. It's kind of hard to be super harsh on this one, but it's also not exactly what we wanted. But what are your thoughts on this month's update?
Yeah, I suppose some progress in the right direction as far as what they've been explaining so far. So it looks like, at least they're on track for their schedule that's already been delayed up until this point. So that's cool to see. And yeah, I guess if they are hoping to get the digital ones that you can buy out, then that would in theory mean that they're going to have them this year. I wonder if we'll actually get any of the actual items this year, or they'll just, once they finally get the physical things in their warehouses and they're, prepping the shipping, then they'll be, ready to actually sell the PDF ones, just because they actually have the physical ones in hand, but not necessarily that we'll get any of the physical stuff quite yet. But it's cool to see that at least some of the physical items is already inbound to their warehouses, so they'll be setting up everything along those ends. But yeah, no, it's cool. I like that they're setting up the editing of the actual play. That should be interesting to see how that turns out. And the virtual one, that should be cool, because I know a lot of people are looking forward to that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting because like I guess there probably is some sort of a maybe legal thing behind the scenes where like they have to have at least shipped out some of the stuff from the Kickstarter before they can actually start to sell it to other people. But I don't really know what the full details on that are. But that's what seems to make sense, because otherwise they should have in a way been able to probably sell it for the last few months, since we have the finalized PDF at this point. So we'll see how that all kind of pans out. But it means we're waiting for next month's update, like pretty much exactly a month on from now. But yeah, next piece of news. Legend of Korra Runes of the Empire Omnibus Edition has been announced. So this is a little bit surprising in a way because it comes very, very soon after the announcement of the Turf Wars Omnibus Edition. This one is scheduled here for April 11th, 2023. So in terms of like the books that are sort of like properly scheduled into the future for next year, this is like the one with like the solid date. Obviously, we know the Azula comic is coming in like the summer, but there's no exact date. And then the new Korra comic trilogy is coming after that. But this is at least some sign of that. 5 months after the Turf Wars one, it does make you question a little bit what's going on with, say, like the Imbalance Omnibus and what way is that going to work. But this is good. This is something they needed to do, and it makes sense because if they're doing the Turf Wars one, it makes sense to have the Runes one follow it straight up, and then the third omnibus will come eventually because that is the next Korra comic coming out. And then we do also have the new cover art here for the omnibus, and it is done by Michelle Wong. So they do seem to be getting the actual like interior artists back to do the covers for these, which is very nice. So this cover features Korra in the front, of course, Kuvira in focus. Asami also has quite a big part of this cover, and then there is also Suyin and Toph on the cover. So Greg, what are your thoughts on the Runes of the Empire Omnibus?
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool that they're scheduling it. I think, like you said, it makes sense that it would follow up the previous one, and we'll get all of them in a row. And I don't know, I like the cover. I think the cover looks really nice. It feels like it flows with what the book was actually about and everything. And, the art as always looks really, really good. So no, I think it's cool that we're getting this out.
Mm-hmm. Next, kind of a little bit of a mysterious one, a bit more to speculate on here, but Jeremy Zuckerman just sort of randomly posted on Instagram story here, this interesting image. So there's nothing really to go off except analyzing the image, but it's a bunch of like pieces of paper, basically here. The one at the top says ATLA Book 1 OST, 01 ATLA Premiere Main Title, Jeremy Zuckerman, orchestrated by Brian C. Harold, and then in the other corner it says concert score, and we can see in the pages behind it, it has like track number 6, Banished, track number 12, Agni Kai, 13, Kyoshi Suite, 24, Into Fire Nation Temple or something like that, a territory, I'm not really sure, and then 26, Roku destroys the temple, we assume. So based on recent information, we would have to assume that this is related to some sort of a re-recording type thing they're doing for the ATLA soundtrack, because I think we've known for quite a while, if we're going to get the ATLA soundtrack, it's going to have to be re-recorded, because he's been very clear that like the quality of like, I suppose, what they have from like original stuff isn't really like ideal for a release like that. So it does seem like they are doing, I guess, an orchestra kind of recording type thing ahead of the soundtrack release. I don't think this is Netflix related. I think Netflix probably would have said Netflix somewhere on these sheets, and I don't really think he's associated with that project anymore. And beyond that, I don't know what else it could be. So this has got people quite excited, but obviously it's still not quite confirmation of everything, even though it feels like it's basically going to happen. But Greg, what are your thoughts on this image?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he's done this before where he's dropped like some hints about things and stuff like that. Usually it's like on Twitter or some other means or along those lines. I mean, this definitely feels, in line with everything that we've been hearing so far, that this is pushing things in the right direction in terms of getting like, an actual soundtrack from the original series and everything like that. So it definitely, it makes it feel like it's like a positive thing, but there's, like you said, there's not super much to go about it because, there's no explanation. Like there's not even like, random, IG text or anything on top of it, or like a GIF or emoji or something like that people normally throw on these things. So I'm not really sure what to make of it, but, it seems cool that they're, working with the music again. So that definitely seems cool. But again, it could be used for any number of things, since we know that there's other stuff going on as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. We're obviously so skeptical about this until it actually gets confirmed. But that interview, it was like they were all but confirming it. So it feels like something's
Hmm.
happening here. It also fits. Like it's in order of book one. But it is interesting. Like what 26 tracks up until just episode 8, which is Roku kind of destroys the temple at the end of episode 8. Um, so if we are getting like all of this is for like a soundtrack thing. This looks like what we're getting like 50 tracks for book one or who knows what. That's pretty exciting. But again, we're just waiting to see sort of a follow up to this, what exactly it's for, that sort of thing. Um, but it definitely says on the front ATLA Book One OST, so it's
Hmm.
there. And the fact that it says like premiere main title makes it feel like I guess that's what it was called back in when he did it initially, because the big problem here is that like this is for a lot of these tracks, it's going to be the first time they've ever had like official titles, because so many people I think don't realize that like the soundtrack compilations that are up on YouTube are mostly like fan put together, both in terms of like names for a lot of those tracks, as well as I think just some of them flat out are like fan edits and stuff like that. So there is some
Yeah.
confusion about what is or is not official when it comes to the soundtrack. But this looks good so far. So that's that. But we move on to the final piece of news, and that is more information on Avatar Generation. So I think we only talked about this very briefly a couple of months ago. There was some like leaks basically that came out. It was to the point where like I think a lot of the stuff was getting taken down, so there wasn't really too much to talk about. But now finally, what's happened here is that there's been a soft launch of the game in a couple of countries, and so there are videos up of basically the first like 20-ish minutes of the game, and a little bit more, I think. So we have a much better sense for what the game is. Plus, there's been an official press release that has come out, so we see sort of what like the intent is, what the plan is for the game as well. Um, where do we start here? I guess I'll just go through the press release. So what it says here is Square Enix London Mobile announces August soft launch for Avatar Generations. So it's a new free-to-play RPG adventure based off Avatar: The Last Airbender. It enters soft launch in Canada, Denmark, South Africa, and Sweden for Android and iOS devices, and this will expand to additional territories and iOS devices in the following months. So that explains like a lot of the videos. I think it's mostly Canadian people putting the videos up, and they're saying that they've released their first look assets from the games, and they link the official website. So I suppose we'll just start there with the website. There really isn't much to it. There is an Avatar Generations logo in white, in black, and then one main like background image, which is like the very early like first episodes Team Avatar. So Aang, Momo, Appa, Katara, Sokka. Really nice, flying over a landscape, but it's very early series type stuff. And then it just has like a basic coming soon situation. It's a tactical RPG, and that's really it. So no like a gameplay or anything like that on the website itself. So interesting that they even link it when it's in such a like basic situation. But what are your thoughts just on this information, the soft launch info, and then what you think of the website so far?
Yeah, I mean the website is it's really just like a holding page for now. I'm sure they'll, add more information to it. Although, there might not be like a huge, like database of information or anything like that, since it is, primarily a mobile game for the most part. But no, I mean it's cool that they're doing the soft launch. I mean, they're doing the close, beta testing and all that other stuff, and so we're starting to see more and more of it. So no, I think I guess they're at the point where they're able to share it off a bit.
Mm-hmm. Um, there's a bunch of quotes from this. So just like, they're thrilled to announce this, that it's the second game from this studio. Players will be able to dive in later this year, so confirming that it'll be worldwide release by at some point later in the year. We don't know exactly when. That's why they're testing it right now with just a few countries. They say here that expanding the beloved universe of the world-renowned property, Avatar Generations invites players to step into the shoes of fan-favorite characters across the franchise. The first chapter introduces Aang, Katara, Sokka, Toph, Suki, and Zuko, accompanied by the much-beloved companions Appa and Momo, as they embark on a globe-trotting quest to fulfill Aang's destiny. So that's just kind of very basic. That's exactly what we sort of expected it to be, that it's going to be some sort of a story recap thing, which is very much what the footage suggests. But then it says, future expansions will explore Avatar Kyoshi, Korra, Roku, and more across the timelines of the four nations. The game will feature epic squad-based battles and unique adventure sequences, underpinned by deep upgrade and party customization systems as players recruit new heroes and grow their team potential. Players will also be able to experience fan-favorite locations, stories, and events in an open world, as well as brand new stories that expand the universe. So that's most of the information that we get on this here. So the big thing here, obviously, is there will be future expansions. I'm assuming they maybe mean chapters of the game, story content that will focus on Kyoshi, Korra, of course, Roku, and more. And then they are very much getting across the idea that there are going to be like unique adventure sequences as well as brand new stories in this. So I don't think that's something we maybe fully expected this to do. But especially when you see like the intro to the game and stuff like that, I think it's very clear that like Generations is a title for a reason with this game, and they are going to sort of use it, what seems like as a way to sort of like really bring people in to the overall like lore of Avatar. So if you don't read the novels, it looks like they're going to have a Kyoshi expansion that will probably cover the stuff from the novels, and so this seems like a good way to get people into sort of like the expanded universe of Avatar once the game properly gets going and has more content other than just like say ATLA. But what are your thoughts on what they have to say here about the sort of plan for the game?
Yeah, it definitely feels like they have like a pretty, I don't know, at least as of now, like a pretty expansive idea of what they actually want the game to be. It sounds, the way that they describe it, which of course, all of them do this regardless of it, but it really sounds like they're trying to make it seem like a lot more than what you would typically expect from a mobile game. And I think, when we talk about some of the stuff we see so far, maybe there's, slightly a good reason for that. But, there's also some downsides with that as well. But I don't know, I don't think I definitely thought that they were going to do like new content, although I wonder, what their new really means, like if it's new towards like stuff that we've seen in like the shows and stuff, but just, incorporating stuff like from the books, like what we just mentioned, then, that could vary, how they go about it. But it's still cool that they're willing, or they potentially are willing to put that into their game, since that's, not necessarily a small undertaking, and a lot of that stuff, like when we see the art that they have so far, that all has to be developed along those lines. So it'll definitely be a cool way to sort of visualize a lot of the stuff that, maybe we've only seen in written word before. So no, I think their aspirations, at least from, this little blurb right here, seems cool. I'm sure, it would be just as cool if this was in sort of a larger scale thing rather than like a mobile. But, this seems to be the first, I guess, viewing that we see of sort of a modern-ish game on Avatar in video game format.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, the biggest thing you can probably do to connect the whole like new stories idea to what they've said is like, how are they going to do an expansion focused on Roku with the information that we have so far? In that, like, is the 306 flashback going to be part of like the Aang story as a flashback, or will they try and incorporate that to be the Roku expansion? Because beyond that, even if you include the Legends RPG stuff, the Roku era information isn't really like Roku focused for the most part. So obviously there's a few mentions of like, oh, he intervened up here on this island, this dispute, but it's not really like Roku story content necessarily. So that's one place where I feel like, okay, there's where we're probably going to get some sort of new Roku story content is through that kind of thing. Because otherwise they have what, Escape from the Spirit World Roku, which isn't much of a story. It's more like an incident that happened. So I think that's what they're planning to do. And of course, like we see Yangchen in the like cool kind of storybook opening that they have for the game. So there's obviously a huge option to do stuff there. There's a quote here from Will Moore, the CEO of Navigator Games, just saying that, you know, like beloved brand, we endeavor to create a game that expands the rich and storied universe of Avatar in a way that feels authentic and exciting to fans of the series and RPG games alike. They're trying to make the game accessible while still actually having some depth to it, and they just mentioned, you know, soft launch period to make the game the best version possible by the time it actually comes out. So I don't think there's too much to say about that. So from this point on, I suppose we have to address what's been covered in some of the videos that we've seen so far. So I think we should talk about the intro to the game. So we get a very cool kind of a fully animated like fire, earth, air, water intro, and it has like, I think it's like what, Korra, Kyoshi, Roku, and Aang are the avatars that they use for that. And then, like I said, they do a sort of Korra style kind of scroll-like opening kind of sequence where they have like Korra, and then they show most of the main past avatars that we know fighting or just in a scene with their greatest enemy. And it includes some very interesting stuff like Karuk and Ko, Roku and Sozin, Wan and Vatu, and interestingly, most interesting of all, Kyoshi and Janzu. That's very interesting that they included him, and not say like Chin the Conqueror or something like that. So our first ever official art of Janju, even though I suppose as we'll discuss in a minute, it's sort of like a direct copy of a piece of fan art, as we'll talk about. But this is really cool, and I think if there's anything that should give you hope about this game, it's just the fact that they did the intro like that, and it's like narrated. They have a narrator kind of talking about Avatar generations, the legacy of the Avatar, and going through a little bit of that. You get a cut of like ATLA, some Korra stuff with the portals and harmonic convergence happening. This looks pretty good, way better than I expected. But what are your thoughts on how they did the cool opening here?
Yeah, no, I agree. The opening, I guess maybe our expectations were set so low that anything they give us is good. But no, I mean, it feels like, obviously some of the stuff is pulled from the shows and stuff like that. So it's not like it's stuff that they had to create originally, all of it at least. But, the idea that they're really focusing, or at least trying to show that they're focusing on the whole generational idea of the avatars and their legacy. It seems like that's a cool thing, and it fits with as of what we know about the game, or at least what they plan to do with the game. And it sort of ends with like the cool sort of splash screen of sort of the younger main characters as well, which who knows, maybe as they do more updates and DLCs or whatever for the game, maybe they'll put in a splash screen for the other characters as well. I don't know, but no, it definitely seems like it's a cool intro to the game of what they have so far.
Yeah, the game title screen is pretty notable as well, because the main thing that I think people have been happy with is that they included Suki as part of Team Avatar, and they mentioned that in the press release as well. So the sort of Where's Suki campaign from a couple of years ago, that in a way felt like led to like her greater inclusion in things, like Suki alone happening, and now her being more included in everything, feels like, okay, yeah, that worked, that makes sense. So that's good to see. As far as gameplay goes, I suppose we don't want to spend too much time going over this, because I suppose we can talk about it more when the game actually comes out. But like they said, it's a tactical RPG, but it doesn't I don't know, the gameplay that you see doesn't really feel like it's very tactical, because it's like turn based on sort of like a kind of like timer like thing that I guess relates to like characters like speed stat or something like that. And it's effectively like, okay, Aang goes first, then the enemy goes, then it's like Katara, then Sokka, and the turn order just kind of repeats itself in that way. So it seems like you can like get buffs and stuff like that to change the order and go quicker. By the looks of things, you have like a basic attack, an advanced attack, an ultimate attack, and like you can do a combo attack, I think, as well. But obviously, the way the game mostly looks, it feels like you just tap the four buttons, and it's as simple as that. There are numbers, there are like buffs, and like some of the attacks have like effects that go off as well. Obviously, early game, you're not going to see too much like actual like depth of gameplay in it, but it looks, in my mind, like pretty good for a mobile game. Like the animations seem, pretty decent. The general like art style seems, pretty solid as well. Again, for a mobile game, I think this just feels like, yeah, like I'd play this. I'm gonna give this a chance. It doesn't look like actively bad or boring. But again, if you have to play like 10 hours of this to maybe get to the new content, it might seem a little bit kind of boring. But what are your general impressions for how it seems to kind of play as a game?
Yeah, no, I think you're pretty much in line there in terms of, how it feels with the combat, the turn-based system that they have implemented, the team party that they have, how you work between the different characters that you have. Like they have a part where they also show Zuko and Iroh working together on the ship as well. I mean, it has sort of like your main components that you would think to have in like this sort of RPG game, which I guess for, like we're saying, for like a mobile game, this feels like it's, pretty good in terms of that regard. Like, it's not like your standard like you would see on any sort of console or any sort of like handheld in that sort of regard. So, you have to keep your sort of like expectations in check in terms of that. But as far as that goes, the sort of like inventory system that they have, the abilities that they have to add the buffs, from what they show so far, it looks interesting. And then, they also have, when they turn into sort of the more story content where they have the characters pick up and they have, your classic dialogue lines and stuff like that. So, for, I think a lot of the previews that they have up, or at least the main ones that I saw, are like around like 20 minutes or so. So you definitely get to see sort of like an idea of what they're trying to do with like the traveling and stuff like that. So I don't know. I mean, I think, it looks, decent for what they're going for. I wonder how, like the system's actually going to work with like the in-game currency and any sort of like external ways to influence that and stuff like that. So I don't know. It definitely seems like at least the idea of making it more of like an RPG game seems like, fits, what we would expect for like an Avatar game, a game that actually has like a story as like a central focus. But I guess we'll have to wait and see how it really works when more people get their hands on it and give more sort of like anecdotal like opinions of the actual game and how it actually works. But it looks okay. I mean, it definitely looks like they put a lot of, I guess, effort into like making the art, for a lot of the different scenes or the characters that we've seen so far in it.
Yeah. The map is kind of cool. Like it is kind of like chibi style, like we've sort of seen in Korra. And in a way, this could end up giving us like the most detailed Avatar world map that we've ever seen. Because like just a little shot like towards the end of some of the gameplay where they show like the Patola mountain range, and you see that like it is these kind of scattered like mountainous islands, and like there's separate parts to it. It's like way more than you can actually make out from some of the like official maps that we have. So you can definitely see the idea of if this is going to be like an expanded in a way version of the story, that we'll learn more about like specific place names and stuff like that. Like I think already like they're using like Wolf Cove, which is a relatively new kind of name that we only recently learned about. That like I think they call it like Hakoda Village or something like that in the game. So there is some new stuff here, and I suppose we should probably discuss that now, and that how they actually do the story here. It is the story of ATLA itself, but you jump in with sort of like a tutorial that is set like just after like what, episode 11, it's set like just after the invasion has failed, but I think it's before Zuko's with the group. And so you have Aang thinking about like they're discussing like getting the people back that they lost during the invasion, and Aang thinking has failed. And then Katara mentions that like, look how far you've come, and then they flash back and do the book one content and seem to just start from there. So I guess we're going to eventually catch up to that moment, which is kind of an interesting way to do the story. And there's also, I suppose, in that flash forward moment, a little bit of a new dynamic where the group fights like Colonel Monkey and the Rough Rhinos in book 3, which we didn't really see happen. So that's new. And then most of the episode 1 and 2 stuff happens exactly as it does in the show. But then, interestingly, they seem to add in a little bit of an extra kind of story to have more kind of combat scenarios before 103 happens, in that they seem to land on this other section of the Patola mountain range where there's a bunch of like fighting dojos in the mountains, and you have to do a little bit of a quest to, fight the dojo master. There's like a new character introduced. It doesn't seem like there's that much depth to it or anything like that, in that it's literally just like 3 different factions. Dojo leader Xing Ming is like the character that you meet. But it looks like this could be a little bit of fun with some slight additions. How exactly this is going to work canonically, and that like, do we have to like add this to the wiki now, this like, minor new information? I'm not really sure. But until I suppose we see the extent of this, it's hard to judge exactly. But what are your thoughts on the kind of altered way they're kind of telling the typical story here?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is, more so just for like, gameplay reasons and stuff like that. So, I guess some of that you take with like a grain of salt in terms of how they're actually showing it to you and when they're showing it to you. But the rest of it, I mean, yeah, it definitely feels like they're sort of, sticking to the storyline, just adding extra, random event encounters and stuff like that so that you actually have something to do along the way, which, makes sense. It's a game. You want it to be entertaining. You want it to have fun. And then, yeah, they do have some extra stuff where it seems like we are meeting new characters. I mean, I do wonder, like you said, if we're going to have to, like, keep track of all this, how much it really, means for the universe overall, if it means at all. I mean, it could just be on its own type of thing, or it could just be sort of a side things that sort of don't really, like, influence anything, but they're cool things to know if you know about them. But no, I don't know, it seems like it's flowing okay so far. I mean, I really wonder how much it actually adds to things or goes in depth with different story beats, but for what it seems, it looks interesting.
Mm-hmm. And then I suppose one of the last things to discuss is just this sort of like currency system, the monetization system and stuff like that, the kind of gotcha element to this. It seems like quite intense. There's a lot of systems here. There's like at least like 3 main currencies in the game, but then it seems like there's actually a bunch of other like sub currencies. There's like nature stone seems to be like the main one in terms of like, I guess, like the kind of free element that you seem to earn as you go through the kind of story, and you can use that to get like certain gotcha kind of things, but then other ones are more locked behind, like you have to like buy these like tickets to spin the wheel basically to get characters. There seems to be a yin yang currency, which looks like the sort of like time gated currency that most of these games tend to have, and that to do any of the story battles you have to spend like 4 of this currency, so you might end up running out of that. Now, the people playing it seem to have like 200 of it from the start, but I don't know if that was some sort of a like beta test type thing, in that it's like 242 out of 42, and like how does that work, and what exactly is going on there. It does seem like there is just a general sort of like gold kind of like currency that you have like 150,000 of, and then from some of the packs you could get, it also felt like there was another system as well related to summonings and stuff like that. So yeah, there's that whole element of it as well. We don't really know like how bad it is, and that like can you progress if you don't spend money? Is it going to be easy or not, or is it just going to be easier if you spend money? Because there are hero summons, support summons, and relic summons in this game. So it seems like obviously you have your characters that you have the attacks and stuff like that, the main thing. But then you seem to have animal support units as well that include like stuff like the wolf spirit from the Search, Appa of course, and a bunch of other animals. But then you have these kind of relics which are like notable items that seem to give you like buffs and stuff like that. There's like a White Lotus tile, a Gyatso statue, a Tianhai statue. So there is some level of depth to it, and I'm just looking here at the relic Tianhai's Hope. What it says it does is like increase turn bar by 15% and heal for 12% of the caster's max HP when they take damage. It has a 2-turn cooldown 3 times per battle, so like there are some stats going on here. So I'm assuming you can get into this game in like a more competitive way, and there's some crazy like maximizing stat stuff, but it also seems like there is a lot going on there. I think some people pulled like from the main thing they had the currency from, and they were just getting like low level items. Like I didn't really see them pull a character even, so I'm not sure how good or not that actually works. But what are your thoughts on this system? Probably the thing they put the most thought into of the game.
Yeah, I mean, that's where it becomes iffy, right? Because you really don't understand how that really works until you're into it, and how gated different sort of, story beats or your progression really is in the story. I mean, I guess, the hope is that it's not too bad, that, you're able to progress, but considering, how games are developed, especially on mobile, which is the thing that everyone's sort of leery about, there's not as much sort of like hope for being able to get around that as much. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I didn't even see like if they showed like how much actually any of that stuff or currently is for the people who are putting it up there. So I don't know. I really do wonder how much of that you actually get when the time goes. So I don't know. It seems interesting. I mean, the parts where they show you like the summons, and like they do show you like the percentage of being able to get them or whatever. So it does show your odds, but that doesn't, if you have like, a 1.6 chance to get like, an airbender flute or something like that, and you need that, then that doesn't seem like, potential really good way to go about things. But I guess, I don't know, that's just sort of how these games sort of function, which is a bit unfortunate.
Yeah, one of the videos I saw does show like some of the stuff in the shops, and like there's a lot going on. Let me just get it up here. So there's like in the store there's like a featured page, and the first thing is like 4-star generic Kyoshi Warrior character, and it says like 6 per account, and it costs like what, I don't even know what this currency is. It's like 800, like, and there's like a mountain symbol. Like I don't even see where that currency is in the menus or anything like that. So it's like, what is that? There's a Kyoshi upgrade bundle that's 1 per account that costs like $39, and they didn't go into it to show what exactly it is, but it does look like it is just like a bunch of like almost like upgrade items, more so than anything. There's a release celebration hero pack that costs $64, and again, the picture shows like a token for the summoning thing, the hero summoning thing, and a bunch of like the nature stones and crystals and stuff like that. And it just goes on. Like there's a release support pack, there's a release relic pack for like slightly cheaper prices and stuff like that. There is some 5,000 free gold once only, but there's not much to say really about that. And then it goes on, like you can buy those nature stones, which the stuff like that. There's like I think there's something like a monthly subscription type thing of like you can get this much gold a month or something like that. So it's got all those systems in place. It seems like, but it's definitely going to depend on like when you actually go to play it. Like, is that like a full on requirement to progress? Like, when some of the really interesting stuff comes out, like say the Kyoshi expansion comes out, and a lot of people are probably going to want to play that because based on what they've shown already, it looks like we're going to get art for characters who maybe only appear in the books and stuff like that, so people will want to see that stuff. Are you basically going to have to pay to get through to the end of those stories in like a reasonable amount of time or not? That's going to be the kind of be the key telling point for the game. Um, I don't really know where it is right now because it feels like without playing it myself, I don't really know how the currency, like how much value there is in any of this stuff. But what are your thoughts on how it's looking so far on that front?
Yeah, I mean that doesn't inspire like a lot of confidence. I mean, I guess really, I don't know. I guess I'm really curious when we do get this, or when more people ever play, like how much is the combat tied to your story progression? Because if that's really what's holding you back, then having to pay $60 to get enough companions and everything in order to keep going is really going to be the breaking point for a lot of people who don't really want to spend all their money on this mobile game like this. Like, I don't know about that, but yeah, I don't know. We'll have to see.
Yeah, and then that's where like a lot of like how much depth actually is there. Like, can you be like a master tactician and like do really well without having to spend money, or is it more like if you just want to press the buttons over and over again, that's where you maybe need to spend money if you don't want to try and like maximize your like buffs and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
we'll see what happens. At the very least, because it's like story driven, it seems like you, I guess, will be given like an a Katara, even if they're only sort of like mid-range versions of those characters. And if you want your like bending master Katara, you have to like pull her out of the summoning banner type thing. But it could lead to some kind of crazy stuff down the line where like people have these like crazy teams of characters where it's like, oh look, it's Yangchen, Yoon, like Sokka and Rangi or something like that, which would be very cool to see, and it likely will give us stuff like that, because I suppose going back a little bit, we probably do need to discuss the whole Jonju thing. We got the first piece of art there, but it is. It feels like a direct copy of one specific piece of fan art that Kachi95, the kind of notable kind of novel fan artist, put out. Now, he's posted about this, and he seems more like, it's a kind of honor of for my art to sort of be like used in a way within the game, but it doesn't seem like he was asked about it or consulted or anything like that about it. So what's the deal here? Obviously fan art's always in a little bit of a weird position, but this feels like a particularly like egregious example of it like being directly copied, traced, whatever way you want to refer to it. It's like it's exactly the same. What are your thoughts on this situation?
Yeah, that doesn't really make for like a good precedence for it being, so notably like one-to-one in terms of that. I mean, it's not the first time that the work has come up in sort of like an official sense, but usually it's more in terms of like referenced rather than like, straight up, or at least what appears to be straight up. I mean, I'm sure, someone had to redraw it or whatever. But, how much of that is worth it for what they're going for here? So I don't know that. I mean, you would hope that they would reach out, especially since this, person has been involved with the fandom for quite a while now, and the fact that we're even talking about it means that people know who they are and that they've been doing this for a while now, and they've done other projects that have helped with this stuff. So I don't know, it seems like it would be like an easy thing to actually reach out to them directly for this in this case here, but maybe there's some other legal reasons that we're not aware of why they're not doing that, or that's just how they want to practice their stuff or whatever. But I don't know. I mean, it's cool that the art's there. It looks good. I mean, that was the whole point, is that it looks like it should be there. So it's definitely cool that it's there. But yeah, the way they went about it, I don't know. It seems a bit iffy. I wonder if it's like big enough that they would actually like say anything about it, like if people made noise, or if people, I mean, the artist doesn't seem to have, like you said, doesn't seem to have as much an issue with it, but for other artists where this is sort of like their main thing is their art, it definitely could be a lot more sort of circumstance to actually see this happen.
Yeah, I definitely think this is one of those positions where like I don't think as the artist you necessarily want to like kind of burn bridges with the like official like stuff going on. So it is more of a thing where like yeah, probably more the community surrounding these artists should like make the point on their behalf rather than them themselves. Um, just to highlight that like when this game actually like starts to come out and we maybe get that Kyoshi expansion, like are we going to be okay if just all the characters are more or less like directly copied from fan art and
Yeah.
it is more than just like one or two specific instances? Like if say like Yoon comes out and it looks exactly the same. Now admittedly I think Yoon we have like a piece of official art, but like say like the other characters like say Kelsong or something like that. Or some of the other Yang Chen characters, are we going to be fine then? Because I think it was relatively okay with the Rongi situation because she was relatively well defined in terms of like the way she was described in the book, in terms of like it's a young female firebender, wears military like armored uniform. There's only so many ways you can do that design, so the the design looking the same from fan art to that feels the same.
Mm.
The problem with Jonju is that like I don't remember him being described particularly well in any of the novels, other than I think like he has a beard, he's an Earth Sage, but we don't really even know what Earth Sage like outfits looked like that much. So there's much more of a sense where like here in this case like very much like a fan artist has done like the character design work for this character, which they've just like taken. um so it's one of those ones where like there probably should be a credit somewhere in the game for like a fan artist if you've based it so clearly on it at the very least. um but it might be a bigger issue down the line, definitely. But yeah, right now we don't really know like what the situation is with regards to when this is exactly coming out. Obviously, the press release is from the 11th, so only 2 days ago, and they're saying this was the like announcement of the soft launch. So, other than them saying like later this year and sort of in the coming months it will come out, we don't really know what the situation is. So, I think it'll probably have like a gradual like rolling launch of like it'll probably launch in like Canada and America and like all those surrounding countries like all at once, and then like all of Europe like maybe a little bit afterwards, or they might reverse that. But we'll all get this eventually. I'm definitely planning to at least give it a try because it's like it's a new Avatar game. When is the last time we said that? I think it would be like silly to not give it a chance, especially because it is free. And like I've never really put money into like mobile games before, so I don't think I'll be like suddenly become like a Avatar Generations like addict just from playing a couple of hours of it. But where are you at with the game? Are you gonna download it when it comes out?
Yeah, I don't see any reason why not to try it. I mean, if it has, interesting parts to it, some action, from what we've seen in the videos, it looks like it could be fun to just play for a little bit just to see how it actually works. But yeah, like you, I'm definitely, I don't foresee, I mean, I don't, I never spend any money in any of those games, so
Yeah.
I don't expect to here unless it's like something so amazing that I feel like I need to spend money. But even that, I can't really see that happening.
Yeah, like, yeah, like it's one of those things where it's just like, maybe if there's like a really cool kind of like event thing and it's like, hey, look at all the Kyoshi characters, like, okay, I'll buy like one thing of like pulls for the gotcha thing to try and like get some Kyoshi characters or something like that. But like definitely not like regularly like just pumping money into it when uh already you maybe get the sense where like, wow, I got like 5 upgrade scrolls and that's it. It seems like the way most of it works. But yeah, it's something to keep an eye on. We do know there are other Avatar games in development. Brian officially said so on the podcast relatively recently, and then Avatar News also in relation to this mentioned that like I think he said he's seen something about one of the other official games that he obviously can't talk about yet. So there are proper, like, normal games coming out as well. But it looks like they're putting some effort into this to make it, something that's somewhat quality. But that is the news, and we'll move on to our main topic here, which is wrapping up our discussion of the Dawn of Yangchen with the final third of the book, chapter 28 onwards. So where we left off was on a bit of a cliffhanger. So we had the chapter where it was revealed that Kalyan is here. He is the boss. He runs the organization within John Duri. And basically we're just in this situation where we're waiting for Kavik to potentially find out what unanimity is. Otherwise, it seems like that's where we're at. So we'll jump in here with chapter 28, which is called Closing the Deal. So what happens in this chapter is that Zongdu Honshe reveals that Chaisi told him no when it came to the message to get unanimity to Bin the chapter also, this is where we get the full reveal that the position of Zongdu is just a position that is bought. You basically go into heavy debt, buy the position, and while you're in that position, you basically skim money off the top until you pay back all your debts and then make yourself a lot of money, and then you retire. That's the whole aim and idea of the Zongdu position, and that's all Zongdu Honshe wants to do. So he heads to John Duri to speak with Chaisi in person. She basically, once again, refuses to give it to him. He threatens her, and she, it seems like, reverses like immediately and is like, yeah, we'll go ahead with it. But she says, but it will take time. So she does the same thing with him that she did with Yang Chen, basically saying yes, but it will take so long that it might as well not happen. So that's the problem here. So he leaves realizing, okay, nothing is going to happen here, but I can get unanimity, but I'll have to use my plant that I've had in John Duri for quite a while, and it's revealed that it is Kalyan. So Honshe and Kalyan have this connection that we're wondering about now, but it's the one truly clever thing Honshe has done in like the entire book, basically up to now. This is how he's going to get unanimity himself. So, Greg, what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, this was interesting to see the two Zongdus sort of interact with each other, like, the heads of their respective city, and to see sort of, how they're trying to play off of unanimity in terms of, for Hansha's sort of goals in terms of controlling his city. He sees it as the way to sort of like survive and get control back in Chaisi. Clearly, she sees it as something that she's invested in, exorbitant amount of money or however much money, but she has other goals, and that's sort of what Hansha is really sort of confronting her with, the whole idea of her being pregnant throughout this whole ordeal, and that sort of leading towards her idea and her place for what the future of the Zongdus might actually be. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, getting the sort of backstory or the history of how at least the current most recent Zongdus have dealt with the position that they're actually in. I mean, I would suspect that maybe it didn't start off as such a position where the whole idea was just to sort of get in, get out, and make as much money. Maybe they had an idea of like actually supporting the cities, but again, it is such a relatively new sort of way of running the city and interacting between the different nations in the world that maybe it's always been corrupt from the beginning. Maybe that's just sort of like a flaw in its inception in the way that it was made, which is just sort of why it's sort of deteriorated to the way that it's been to at this point. But you definitely get the idea of how it works here, which I think is good that you actually now have a better understanding of that, and just Henshe as in general, just his sort of history, how he came up towards this position, and sort of his sort of, I guess, internal ramblings on terms of like why is it falling apart during his term and everything like that. But no, I thought this was good just to really get an idea of how this part of the current, system between the Shang cities is currently working, at least. Maybe not how it always was, at least.
Yeah, there was a little bit revealed, I think, back in when we got the history lesson on this, back in the first third of the book, where they mentioned that the first like Zongdus, the first heads of the cities were like just the like noble families basically selected to get the position. So I guess it might have been slightly different at the start, but obviously with nobles you never know what exactly you're going to get, and so they obviously turned it into sort of like, hey, who wants to like buy this important position? And we see that it's turned more into the money thing rather than really being about the leadership. The other thing here is that Chicey is basically mentioned by Hansha that unlike you, I don't want to build a dynasty. So he actually is the one to directly say to us that, based on him, who knows her better, he views what she's doing as wanting to build this legacy here in Jondaree of like create power here on Jondaree forever, which is the opposite of what she said to Yangchen, that she only wants to stay in power for her time as Zongdu. So, which is correct and so on, and what's going on here. It's very interesting. But yeah, we'll move on from there, and then we go to chapter 29, which is following through. So, a lot to discuss with this one, in that like this is basically like the only chapter that Kalyan is like properly like in, and a lot happens in it because it's the Kalyan conversation, and huge amount of like plot gets moving because of the events of this chapter. So we'll probably be staying on this one for a little bit here. So at the start, what we get here is that Kavik like immediately attacks Kalyan, and Kalyan sort of just lets him do it because he sort of knows that like, oh yeah, I haven't been in touch with the family, he deserves to get this anger out. So he lets Kavik attack him until it starts to get a little bit more serious and he's kind of starting to get hurt. But immediately Kalyan reverses the situation, highlighting that he's a much more skilled fighter than Kavik is, and forces him to stop. He asks about the family. Kavik's like, you don't get to ask about that given what you did, that you never contacted the family. He says that he couldn't, like, look at where we are, we're in Jondaree. Communications in and out are like monitored. I couldn't possibly have done that. So then we basically get the kind of backstory that we didn't quite get on Kalyan. So we heard from Kavik's perspective these mysterious events of like Kalyan becoming an errand runner. But here's what actually happened. So it's explained that he, in Bin-Ur, began to associate with all these other ambitious young people in Bin-Ur. This is where he met a younger Hansha before he was a Zongdu, and the two worked well together and kind of worked their way up in their different roles, I suppose. Kalyan as more of the errand runner style thing, and then Hansha becoming a more and more important administrator, until eventually like he gets the position of Zongdu, at which point he inserts Kalyan into Jondaree to be a long-term plant and have eyes in a different Zongdu city. So we'll discuss it just up to there. So what are your thoughts on the initial back and forth between the brothers here, and then Kalyan's backstory?
Yeah, I thought Kalyan's backstory was pretty cool. I mean, I think, initially you get sort of Kavik's perspective of his brothers, just sort of like he's been doing some job, he's slowly been, moving farther and farther away from the family, and has, up until this point, lost complete sort of contact with the family, doesn't have anything to do with them. And, Kavik, almost up until this point has pretty much almost given up on his brother entirely. Like, his idea now is just to get his family, his mother, his father out of, Ben-Ur, so that they can just leave all of that behind. And, his brother, up until this point, wasn't really sort of like a main focus. So to see him come back here and to understand sort of what he was doing, how he was setting up these deals, how much, important Kalyan's sort of like information gathering skills and his abilities was able to sort of, bring someone up who, I mean, they say he was like a low level, and shit was like a low level administrator, but, still from whatever position he was up until the most important position in Ben-Ur, probably isn't some sort of like a small undertaking. So it's cool to sort of get, perspective on that, and, I guess to see the comparison between the two brothers, to see how, I guess how much better, Kion was than Kavik in terms of growing up, which he is the older brother, and, he has more experience. So, even when we see the sort of like tables being turned on the battles, like you mentioned earlier, you can see his sort of abilities that he has there. But no, I thought this was really cool to finally, get the brothers interacting, see what, was the true story behind things and how they might progress from it forward.
Mm-hmm. And then immediately in this next section, we begin to see like the kind of more the truth about the character, that it isn't just that like, oh, this is him just trying to make a better life for himself, but that he really has begun to like this sort of life as a sort of almost like kind of crime lord type character here. Of he goes on like he says he has power and influence now because he's effectively like almost like second in charge of John Dory here, and he basically says that he can make the damage that Kavik did in the previous chapters kind of go away because people will listen to him, and if he interprets it as Kavik saved half of the stuff, people will agree with that. And he even goes as far as to say that, I've had to sort of like bail you out of all of these situations again. You're not as good as you think you are. You wouldn't have even got through any of the tests if I wasn't like aware that you were here and sort of like kept you from being noticed by Chai Si. So that's a big point in all of this in terms of the whole like Kalyan is the great, Kavik is the lesser, and that whole dynamic. So Kalyan quickly figures out and explains to him that like, I know you're working for the Avatar. It's the only possible way you could have turned up here out of nowhere, and it's they're not the only ones like who can like travel so kind of like cleanly around the world in this era, and that's how he sort of figures it all out because Yangchen turned up here right at the same time he did. But now what Kalyan needs from Kavik is he needs Kavik to lead Yangchen astray, because he basically points out here that like, okay, I'm working for Zhongdu Hanshe, and what he needs is he needs unanimity. If he doesn't get it, then that puts me in danger, and basically my life is at risk. So if I don't do this, I'm in trouble, and I need you to do this so that I don't die. And he really puts it on Kavik here of like, you owe me one, you don't owe anything to the Avatar. Don't act like working for the Avatar is this like amazing thing. No, you owe me, I saved your life in the past. This is me, cashing in that debt here. I want you to do this for me. So he wants Kavik to basically give Yangchen this sort of false information so she will temporarily be off the trail of where unanimity is, and it will allow Kalyan to get unanimity into Hanshe's hands. And there's this point where like Kalyan does mention that like, I did plan to come back like eventually, but it's very unclear on like if that feels really meaningful coming from him, or if this is just him trying to, in a way, further manipulate Kavik here than he already has. And Kavik at this point realizes that like, who is this person I'm talking to? Like, we're Water Tribe, we're family. Why are we talking about like, making amends for like saving each other's life like it's this business transaction? And he realizes that, oh, part of this is that also Kalyan wants Kavik to be a plant within the Avatar's retinue, and he basically confirms that like, yeah, you got it in one. Like, if we're just talking straight down to business, yep, that's it. So kind of realizing that like, oh, his brother's more about the business than anything else at this point. But he can't, I suppose, move past the idea of like, if he doesn't help his brother is probably going to die because of the political situation going on. And so he reluctantly agrees. It's noted in the book that like he sort of falls to this weakness here. He breaks at this point and just has to help his brother. So very notable point in the book here, because just like 3-4 chapters ago, we had the big scene where Kavik like truly became the Avatar's companion. He showed how incredible he was during the fight at the dock, and then boom, like one meeting with his brother, and it's all sort of like fallen apart. All the bad stuff from the past brought up again, and he's no longer the character that we had so much hope for just a few chapters ago. It's a huge character shift chapter, and I think it was very interestingly done. I think there's a lot to discuss here. So I suppose just like what's your take on kind of Kalyan throughout this scene here in terms of how much he has changed here? Is this just the whole idea that like Kalyan is in a way more of a Shang merchant now than a Water Tribe man, or how much is he manipulating his brother here, and how much has he changed?
Yeah, it definitely feels like he's changed a good bit here. I mean, just the way that he structures this, the way that, you know, they talk about in the book how like his thought process, how he's thinking so fast about the different situations, how he's, you know, going to sort of recover from the situation. I mean, you know, he does try to throw in like some hints here and there in terms of like, you know, the more sort of their like familiar sort of, you know, nature that they have with each other. But it seems like it's really, you know, he's really gearing it towards, you know, what his end goal actually is. And, you know, like you said, he admits to, you know, having someone in the Yangchen's retinue would be, you know, like a boon for him and his association. So it seems like, you know, even if he is trying to sort of like bail himself and his brother out of this, you know, current situation that, you know, he admits himself that they're a bit sort of like over their heads, he's still, you know, trying to sort of keep things going maybe for the long term, you know, assuming everything works out as well as it can, which, you know, that sort of goes upended in the end. But, you know, it seems like he's trying to sort of plan things out, and, you know, he really is luring in his younger brother here with, you know, the situation at hand. And, you know, it seems like, you know, Kavik is definitely, you know, either because he's younger or just because of what he's had to deal with, he seems like he's, you know, a lot more, I guess, nicer or accepting, or hasn't quite become as sort of hardened as his older brother is. So he's, you know, he gives in relatively, you know, quickly to this, or, you know, just sort of the logic of everything that's going on, since, you know, up until a little while ago, he was still really trying to find his brother and didn't really think, you know, he was totally without sort of help or anything. So a lot of that, I'm sure, plays into Kavik's sort of like mentality and thought process in terms of just accepting that he's going to have to betray, you know, Yangchen, the Avatar, at this point.
Mm-hmm. The remainder of this chapter is basically just sort of like the aftermath of this. We do get Kavik going to Yangchen, giving her the fake information, but it's not completely fake. It's just sort of like the timing of the information is wrong. He tells her that unanimity was tested in Port Tugok and will soon make its way to Jondari. She completely trusts Kavik at this point, and so immediately believes this information and plans to like immediately help out. Like she hugs him and is like, I knew I was right to trust you, and it just really hits the point home of like Kavik has betrayed Yang Chen in this situation, and this is a major point in the book. And then the very last sort of sequence is that he's kind of stays away from everyone else, you know, because it can work. Like, okay, I have to stay with the association for a while, basically following Kalyan's orders, and is eventually put on the same ship that is going to transport unanimity to Bin And it's just this idea that, like, in the room next to him is unanimity, but he's got there by betraying Yang Chen, and it's like, where are we going in the book after this point? So yeah, what are your thoughts on this? He actually goes through with it, and he's right next to the big mystery.
Yeah, no, I thought that, you know, that's kind of funny how that works out in sort of like the end. Like, you know, you're trying so hard to find something and then it's just right there in front of you, but you can't do anything about it, or you can't do what you originally intended to do. But yeah, no, it definitely, you know, I think the whole conversation with Genshin, it really does get across, you know, how much, you know, this sort of betrayal hurts him as a character. I think they get get that across pretty well, that, everyone seems like a blow to him personally. And even, the other people that are there as well, the other two Water Tribe members, because, they've been, up until this point, they've been pretty supportive of everything. So he definitely feels that from them as well. And the fact that he can't tell them that they're being watched or anything like that, I think all of this is really, something that gets to Kavik, and then, he just has to sort of hide out at the sort of, the house there with Trujinta, which, they make mention that he also sort of described him as well as a bit. So it gets to see that he's going to have some more integral part in this sort of story coming up soon as well.
But yeah, it's a very notable chapter because, like, the only mentions of Kalyan going forward are basically like, in a way, like little flashbacks of like Kalyan told Kavik to do this. So like he's only really in the one chapter in like the entire book, yet plays this like super integral role. And that's what makes him so interesting, is that like coming out of the book, like he's obviously still alive, but you don't know where he is at the end of the book necessarily. And then what position is he in? Because it feels like what they're going with is that, in a way, Kavik never fully knew his brother. Like, his brother was always this very ambitious person who wanted a better life for himself, and has done that by going down a more criminal path. And Kavik followed that path, but always refused to do the kind of like darker aspect of being an errand runner. Hence the stuff of like he doesn't want to be a head kicker and stuff like that. Whereas Kalyan has like almost like fully embraced all aspects of that and is now the boss of an errand runner organization. And it's this real sense of like they both went down the same path. One won't go that far, one will. And I'm very interested to see where they go with this, because it feels like the unfinished business here is that Kavik needs to sort of, in a way, like get one over on his brother and like prove himself that he is the better brother ultimately. That, okay, Kalyan's more skilled, but Kavik is better in a way. But where do you stand on Kalyan, like coming out of the end of the book here, given that like we don't really see him again?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely going to have an integral role sort of coming up, just because they're going to have to sort of deal with him and his whole situation. But yeah, I think you definitely do get the idea that he's embraced this lifestyle a lot more. I mean, he doesn't have any issue affiliating with people. I mean, I think that was something that they made, note to mention, that Kavik, despite, working as an errand runner and taking sort of like any job without pay and, not necessarily needing to know what the full details of whatever it is that he's doing, he wanted to stay independent. He wanted to have that sort of separation for what he's doing. But Caroline, his brother, definitely, the fact that he's rose up to this position and, doesn't seem to have any issues, following along with Chaise's sort of orders of like, sort of just getting rid of people when they have to, be involved in any sort of situation, definitely is on odds with Kavik and sort of what his, morality is, more or less. So it definitely will be cool to see when Kavik hopefully does get a one up on his brother, and that'll probably be pretty important for his character overall.
Next chapter, chapter 30, Dreams Within Dreams. So it's basically Yangchen on her way to Port Tugok when she basically remembers the exact details of what happened to Jetson. So up to this point, like, we know that Jetson is dead, and she died in some sort of a spiritual related issue that where like her spirit, her soul is trapped. And so we find out what happened, and that like it is a direct continuation of chapter 2. So Yangchen's first ever trip to the spirit world, and we see the continuation of that. So things are going well until they encounter a group of kind of Shishi spirits that we saw in Legend of Korra. And suddenly it all goes wrong because Yangchen like freezes. Suddenly she is radiating this kind of fear of them. But Jetson's not sure why, because Yangchen isn't afraid of like large animals and likely shouldn't be afraid of spirits, but it's revealed that actually this is one of those past Avatar memory situations. some past avatar was very, very afraid of the spirit world and spirits, and this fear causes these spirits to go dark. And so Jetson realizes things are going very badly here and basically points out to Yang Chen, okay, you need to wake up now. You need to think about waking up in the spirit world, and that will eventually make you wake up from the trip to the spirit world. But waking up for Yang Chen is obviously a difficult thing because of the way this kind of gift, the way it actually affects her. And this isn't working. She's so frozen with fear, she can't even think about that. So Jetson basically grabs Yang Chen, and they do the same thing from A New Spiritual Age, where Yang Chen is now a very, very young child, basically a baby at this point, because of how much her emotions are affected by this. So Jetson is carrying this young Yang Chen and realizes that they're not going to get out of this. So she stops, she throws Yang Chen up into the air, which sort of forces Yang Chen to wake up. But because she had to stop, she basically gets captured by the spirits. And the ending of the chapter is the idea that Yang Chen wakes up in the physical world, and everyone else is asking what happened. Why hasn't Jetson woken up? And we get a little bit more at the start of the next chapter, but this is the core incident that happens. That this is the main negative impact of the whole, special connection to the past avatar's memories that she has, is that it effectively caused the death of Jetson. I think it's a really interesting reveal to have this chapter 2 reveal, get more information in chapter 30, and it fits all the little pieces and clues that we've got over the course of the book. I love the references to book 2 episode 10, a new spiritual age, in that it's basically that in reverse that happens here, and it just sets up some really interesting stuff going forward. This plot point isn't really resolved in this book, so it's going to be an interesting one to speculate on. But what are your thoughts on this kind of flashback chapter?
Yeah, I think this was pretty, I don't know, it's really interesting that they, took that amount of time to sort of connect sort of the chapters and to actually get her full story here. I mean, I think, from everything that we've learned up until this point, it makes sense that this would sort of be, the end result of her sort of, not being able to return from the spirit world and sort of what happened to her physical body here. But, just the whole story here, how much it affected Yang Chen, I think it really gets across the point that, for her gift and what it can be used for, it also has this sort of, underlying sort of bad thing that's happened to her with it, and it's something up until this day that she really can't fully get over. And then with what the previous spirits, the Phoenix Eel spirit showed her, it's even more so in her mind that there's extra sort of ramifications from this that she wasn't even aware of at the time. But just coming across this incident here, I mean, she was pretty young when this actually happened as well. And, she's still rather young as a character. So, it hasn't really, passed that much time, which is probably why it's still so sort of raw and emotional for her as a character. And, just the whole idea of when she did finally wake up that, she was being addressed as sort of the avatar and sort of, having to deal with that situation, especially at a younger age, even though, she's known for quite a while that she's been the avatar, of course, but, having to actually deal with avatar situations, especially when they're, something or someone around you directly, is not quite an easy task to have. So it definitely, I don't know, shows the gravity of the situation and why she's still, dealing with it till this day.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, the next chapter, Basic Tradecraft, the first section of it follows up the events of the previous chapter. So you have Yang Chen remembering Jetson's funeral, and then afterwards trying to research which past avatar it was that was afraid of spirits. But she just kind of notes that that was not a good avenue to go down, because it was kind of is she blaming an event from her own life on a past avatar? Is that a good way to think about this? But she has been back to the spirit world multiple times after this, trying to find the same location. Can she find the same spirits and figure out what went down? but she hasn't. She's never been able to go back to that exact same location, and she hasn't found those kind of dog-like spirits ever again. So it's this kind of failing that she feels like she has, that like there's a reason why I can't get back to that location. Then she remembers, like you mentioned, Greg, the Phoenix Eel spirit vision is like this extra clue that she now knows that, oh, like her spirit is still alive somewhere, and she just makes a vow that someday she will find Jetson. But for now, she has business to attend to in Port Tugok. So very much just like, okay, we'll, I guess, deal with this in the next book if we have time to do it. But nice that they gave us most of the kind of key information, and now it's sort of like, okay, how is she going to find out about the Fog of Lost Souls and get into the spirit world and find Jetson? It's a very interesting thing to consider. But what are your thoughts on this first part of this chapter?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that, Jetson is trapped and that's going to be something that she's going to potentially deal with, I think is definitely a cool thing, because, we've seen how that whole sort of situation works and how people can, in some form or another be brought back from that. So it's definitely, has some potential. I do wonder if they're really going to focus on that in the next chapter, because there's a lot of other things, and in terms of the core story here, that might not be on the sort of high priority list of things to actually have to do. But it's definitely a cool idea. I thought it was interesting just how they sort of are setting that up here. I think they also make a mention to Guru Lahima in here as well, so it's interesting to see that they're sort of connecting all those sort of lines and threads together. But yeah, it's definitely really going to be something, I guess, cool to see, and influential to her as a character if she can sort of recover the soul, and what that might mean for the future of her in terms of just being an avatar. Like, is that someone that she can actually commune with directly and get sort of opinions and other ideas from, which is something that she's mentioned that she would have liked to have early on when she was talking with Kavik.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the obvious question is like, if she finds Jetson, what then? Because I guess Jetson has to make a decision about, like, she either just stays in the spirit world and becomes like a spirit, like an Iroh or a Painted Lady, or is there another option? Like, because we assume she's gonna like get her out. I doubt they'll do anything too tragic here, but can you make the decision to be like, well, I was forced to stay here? Can she choose to like try and like meditate out, but because her body is gone, she just sort of like completes her like death and like reincarnates or something like that? It would be very interesting to see how they go about doing this, because if they do just decide that, okay, Jetson's going to be a spirit, then it's kind of like, ooh, which spirit is it? Like, have we seen Jetson in a different form and in some other piece of content or not? Do you have any thoughts on that sort of like the kind of like mechanics of what way they're going to do the Jetson reveal?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess it would be cool if she was, just stayed around just so that, Yangchen could communicate with her, sort of like an Iroh, like we've seen before. And, it doesn't necessarily have to mess with other things in terms of, like certain spirits can only reveal themselves, or if they want to other people. So, she could have, in theory, been around this whole time and we just wouldn't know it, because why would she reveal herself or something like that? But I don't know. I mean, I think, whatever they do, it'll provide sort of like enough closure for Yangchen, even if they do have to sort of like let her go finally, because she just has to sort of let go of all of her sort of tethers and stuff like that. So they might go that route, just in terms of sort of the air nomad sort of practices and stuff like that. But again, she's the avatar, so she has more of a hold on things than typical air nomads.
Mm-hmm. The middle section of this chapter is basically this sort of like stealth infiltration sequence as she makes her way into Port Tugok. She like infiltrates a lumber yard here near the docks. She is quickly like tailed by multiple people. She's like in disguise, trying to stay undercover, but realizes that she's basically being herded into a trap. So she realizes, okay, I'm gonna have to fight to kind of get my way out of here, which she does, and she like earth bends pretty effectively, takes out the guards, but in the middle of all of this, one of the guards does see like her arrow tattoo, so basically confirms that she's the Avatar. So she now has like some basically unconscious guards that she needs to deal with, and she has to stash them somewhere. So this leads us into the final section of the chapter, which we'll get to in just a second. But yeah, a large part of this chapter is this kind of infiltration sequence. The main things to a note here are that like we see airbending assisted speed get used for like one of the first times ever. Like Aang uses it a few times, but it's explained here. It does use a lot of energy, she explains, but it's nice to see it be brought up again. And then beyond that, it's like, okay, pretty clever move she does right at the end. Otherwise, it's just, you know, Yangchen being her kind of spy master self here in Port Tugok. So what are your thoughts on this kind of Metal Gear Solid sequence we kind of get here?
Yeah, it really does feel like that. Like the whole idea of her like considering what entry points to get into the city or into the port. Like, she mentions that she could just like drop down in there, but obviously that would give her away. So no, she goes a different way. She puts Nugent on sort of like the side, and then she figures out her way in. I think she uses like, she uses the cover and debris of like sort of dirt and air to sort of, hide her presence from the guards, where she does do the assisted running, which they do a bit of a more in-depth breakdown in terms of, like you said, like the amount of energy. I think that's something that they get across this whole sort of section here of how much, actually, effort and exertion she's actually using to perform these various maneuvers. Because I think, sometimes when we watch the show, except in certain cases, like it almost seems like, like Aang and Korra almost have like unlimited energy depending on the situation, of course. But here you definitely get the idea that, she becomes pretty exhausted after all of this and having to like deal with this and mentally trying to like figure out what they're trying to do. So they definitely have a pretty sort of like in-depth sort of like internal monologue of what's going on, which is pretty much just par for the course of most of this book, especially with the whole sort of like spy master angle of things. So no, I thought that was pretty cool how they built up that whole situation of her getting to the city. I mean, at this point, if you've gotten this far in the book, it feels pretty much in place with everything that we've seen so far. So it's not anything super new or anything like that, but it's cool to see, how she's dealing with this and trying to keep her cover until she, sort of gets found out eventually.
Yeah, there's a little bit of world building here where like they do explain like the whole Port Tugok situation, that like, oh, the Shimsam Islands that we heard about in the Kyoshi novels, that Port Tugok is on Shimsam Big Island, and it's not directly in the Southern Water Tribe, but it's in an island quite close to it, and there's some stuff like that gets brought up. Similarly, the Zongdu of Port Tugok does get mentioned by name, but it's explained that this guy basically stays in the Northern Water Tribe most of the time and like hasn't really been there in like a year. So obviously very hands-off Zongdu for this place here. But the last section is very fun here. So she realizes, okay, I there is somewhere nearby I can stash them, but like I really don't want to interact with these people. That's Yangchen's approach. So she heads to a nearby Order of the White Lotus like depot basically, and knocks at the door. Someone answers, and she immediately goes into the whole like coded phrase thing, and the open wide, to those who know its secrets, and that whole thing. And the guy, I guess, recognizes that, okay, it's the Avatar. You're not a member. I know you're not a member. But she just continues to go through the whole sequence and in words describes the placement of like all the tiles as if they're playing the game, because he refuses to kind of let her in to play the game so they can do the full exchange. So she does this. It doesn't really get her anywhere. And then she's just like, I think you should let me in because I've got these unconscious guards nearby. And then he chooses to act and be like, okay, I'll get a higher level Lotus to address this. So out of almost nowhere in the book, Order of the White Lotus stuff gets brought up, and I like just the idea of like Yangchen basically like mocking the organization and like how silly a lot of the sort of secret stuff is. Like a lot of people like to really hero worship almost Order of the White Lotus, but we get sort of this different perspective on them in this book, and it's actually adds quite a bit of depth to the organization, which I quite like. But what were your thoughts on the end section of this chapter?
Yeah, you definitely do get some depth on this. Just the idea that, she's able to sort of just whittle off, the moves on the board, how you're supposed to like do it again, reflected on the other side. I don't think, we've ever really gotten such a breakdown of the actual moves and everything like that. So it definitely was fun to see, her sort of, I guess, sort of like initial thoughts, or how you perceive her initial thoughts on the Order of the White Lotus, and just sort of how reluctant she is towards wanting to interact with these people, but this is sort of like a desperate case scenario for her. But no, I think it's cool. I mean, the fact that this means like a lot for her in terms of like the Avatar and the Order of the White Lotus, and how this plays out in sort of the larger scheme of things as we see in sort of like the next chapters and stuff. It's definitely pretty cool. I don't think I expected this, really. I don't think so. I don't think I really had any sort of thought that they would come up, somewhere in this book per se. But it's definitely a welcome thing to see.
Mm-hmm. So in next chapter, Conversation, chapter 32, Yangchen's let inside. She basically sleeps for a little bit because she's obviously exhausted after this. So when she wakes up, she has a conversation with sort of the highest ranking Lotus present. The character just calls herself, call me Mama. So I suppose the first thing here is that when you read this book for the first time, did you immediately connect Mama to Mama Ayunarak from like 30 chapters ago? Because the first time I read it, I don't think I did, because there was so little kind of connection in a way. And it's only on a reread that I really realized, like, oh yeah, there it is, because they don't say Mama Ayunarak and Order of the White Lotus basically until like the last chapter. But what was your thing with this when we find this out?
Yeah, I think initially I definitely didn't get it, at least not just from this part here. I mean, I guess, in hindsight, it makes sense, but I don't think, not until the end did I really sort of get that full connection. But it's a nice sort of setup there in terms of like the whole cover setup and stories.
And it is actually really well connected, because if you go back to the last Mama Ayunarak bit in the book, Kavik gives her the money and tells her to go down south to Port Tugok, to visit your family, basically, which effectively is what she does. It's just for different reasons. So basically the interaction between Ayunarak and Yangchen here is that they both don't like each other's approach to dealing with like world events, basically things that happen. Ayunarak thinks that Yangchen is far too active, and that she shouldn't be consulting the Order of the White Lotus over whatever kind of little mission she's on. Yangchen dislikes the Order of the White Lotus because they refuse to take action until moments happen that they deem as being like of world importance, great import. So it's just this argument over, how active should you be or not, and it's just a clear difference of opinion that they sort of have here. So Mama wants Yangchen to stop basically playing spy master and sort of consider what type of avatar she wants to be. Yangchen sort of, I suppose, is used to this sort of approach to people when they probably properly get to know her, and just sort of like, dismisses it. In her head, she's just thinking of like, oh, what sort of a figurehead do you want me to be? Pose for my avatar portrait and that sort of thing. But Ayunarak suddenly brings up that like, oh, you could use your gift and you could basically tell the world about all of the details that have been sort of lost to history about Avatar's past. You of anyone can talk about what made the gilded eras of the world, and just use truth basically to bring peace to the world, bring balance to the world. And Yangchen is immediately like, wait, how do you know about my gift? Because suddenly we get this reveal that like, oh yeah, like this was kept secret by the high ups at the Western Air Temple. The high ups at the Western Air Temple were the only ones who knew about Yangchen's gift. And so Yangchen basically figures out by herself that, wait, that means you had an Order of the White Lotus member within the Western Air Temple for like my entire childhood. And she's really affected by this because she's in a way used to, for like the last couple of years of her life, being deeply involved in spies and stuff like that, because that's how she gets stuff done. But she really doesn't like the idea that she was basically being spied on during like those early years of her life, which she considers as being some of like the best parts of her life, effectively the all that time she had with Jetson. And now this has almost planted the seed of doubt, because who was it? Does she suspect Boma? Does she suspect that it might have been Jetson, who maybe was Order of the White Lotus? It's a really kind of big reveal here, and I think a Unarak kind of coming out of this little dynamic realizes that, like, oh, I kind of have hurt her here by sort of revealing this, and the harshness of their interaction begins to sort of like calm down a little bit after this. But what are your thoughts on this kind of difference in like philosophy that these two kind of key characters have here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the difference in philosophy, that's not sort of like anything crazy or unique or anything like that. I mean, they have different experiences and different, ways about going things. And, obviously one has, through past lives more experience than the other technically. But, Mama doesn't really quite see that at this point, at least, in this chapter. But, the idea that, Yangchen could have used that experience, is a valid point. I mean, it is a valid point here, but just to see how Yangchen is so affected by this sort of mention here, and, she has to make note of this like multiple times, like, how do you know about this? It really, you really do get the sense of how, for Yangchen personally, that period of time up until, the unfortunate incident with Jetson was probably like, despite, all of her issues with her actual gift, was, a happy time for her, a time where she thought that, things were going, the best possible way that they could. But yeah, no, this definitely has sort of like tainted everything, just a little bit, which is something that, despite her currently, being the spy master that we keep mentioning and having to deal with things, is something that she didn't really want to have to face at all. So, any of the people that were there in the temple with her growing up, she thought that there was, some secret, that they weren't going to share any of those sort of details, but clearly it got out. And, who knows if it was any of the, like, the higher up people at the Western Air Temple. I mean, in theory, it really could be anyone, right? But, it's probably someone who's closer to her than not, considering, how much Mama seems to know about her gift, or what she thinks she knows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they sort of make the point about, like, how, like, I think Yangchen sort of slumps to the ground at one point, and, like, a Unarak kind of catches her head, which was referenced directly, I think, in either chapter 1 or chapter 2. So she's kind of like, oh, this person must have been in that meeting of the high up somewhere. So yeah, it could have been any of like a couple of characters. The last bit of this chapter is that Yangchen basically addressing what Unarak had said here, says like, I've already basically done that. I was like, what? She's already tried and succeeded many times at communicating with past avatars, much more than she's ever even made publicly known to, like, people at the Western Air Temple or anything like that. She says, like, she's spoken to dozens upon dozens upon dozens of past avatars. She's asked questions, received answers, experienced like whole sections of their lives. It's a lot of information, but the main pattern that she always takes from these interactions is just that all of the past lives have regrets, and they all wished that they were more active. None of them wished that they had ever taken more time to consider a situation. They felt the exact opposite than that. And this basically serves as another way to further explain why Yangchen chooses to be so exceptionally active as the Avatar and not ever just sort of wait to see how things pan out, because no past Avatar has ever like wished that they had taken that approach. And she also notes as well, like, she doesn't say it out loud, but in her head is like, I don't remember having ever seen a single like gilded era. So this idea that like the difference of opinion. Like a Unarak seems to think certain generations of the past were these amazing like golden eras for the world, but from Yang Chen's perspective, none of them were. Highlighting that like even the avatars during the good eras were always like struggling to keep things in even like a reasonable way. And then we just end with Ayunarak explaining why she is in the south. She's investigating a spiritual disturbance down here, bright lights and loud noises. And Yang Chen, after this big discussion, agrees to sort of trust the Order of the White Lotus for now, and explains about unanimity, why she is down here. So a little bit of trust at the end, but still very different kind of approaches ultimately. I think this is probably one of the best chapters in the book to see like this is Yang Chen's approach as the Avatar, and this is why she has that approach. That here in a way is why we haven't really done much with the past avatars in the books, because Yang Chen doesn't find a lot of that all that useful for the situation that she's in. That she mainly takes the kind of negative aspects of the what's happened here to heart more so than anything. It's quite like impactful as well, because she says stuff like I felt the shame of avatars gone by, lived through failures not recorded in history. So very like, I know way more about this than you think you know. This is how it actually is. It's not the amazing way you think it is. Really, really good chapter in my mind. But what are your thoughts on the remaining parts of this chapter?
Yeah, I think it is pretty good. It really does give you a sense of Yang Chen's character and why she's so active, and she's really tries to get across the point to Ayunarak, why the way that the White Lotus's generally ways of operating is just so it doesn't mesh with her mentality of how to actually do things, because of what she's seen in the past and how all the past Avatar shames have affected her very deeply. And I wonder if that's just because those are the ones that sort of are like shocked into her when she's experiencing her gift, or if it's just because that's just how those are the more prevalent ones of the past avatars, so they come to the surface more than sort of the good ones per se. But regardless of that, she's communed with them enough that this is the pattern that she's seen in their history. And from her perspective, like you said, there hasn't been any gilded age or no era that's perfect, which, I mean, I would, suspect that, no era is ever perfect. And it's always sort of like, the current is always thinking the past has always had it better than it currently is, which, it's always amount of like sort of like perspective and whatnot. So that's just sort of where they stand in terms of viewing the history and how good things used to be potentially. But clearly it hasn't been all sort of right as rain in those past instances here. So Yang Chen is trying to make the best of what she's able to do, and considering that she's trying to be as active as she can, and she's even come to the point where she's willing to work with the White Lotus in terms of getting things going towards the right direction here, and is actually willing to talk with them.
Yeah, and then a point I just want to mention, because I've seen a bunch of people sort of like misinterpret this and assume that Yang Chen, the way she communicates with the past avatars, only works the way her like gift works. But in this direct sequence, she explains that it works that way, but she also can talk to them normally in the typical way that we've seen, because like this chapter directly states that like she asked questions and received answers, which, based on the way it was described in like the earlier chapters, that is not how her like being possessed by the memories of a past life works. So I think that was part of the point of like say chapter 2, that spiritually like everything else works perfectly fine. It's just that she happens to have this much deeper connection and can effectively experience whole chunks of a past avatar's life if she wants. So she has this kind of extra thing that she's I suppose, mostly grown to control, but she can do it normally as well. Um, the next chapter is called Traces, chapter 33. This is a bit quicker, but basically, Mama reveals that the ship Yangchen is looking for has not been spotted recently. There's another mention here of like, do you trust the source that told you this? And Yangchen says, yes, she does. So they're referencing Kavik's false information, as we know. So they move to investigate what a Unirock is there for. So they get on Yangchen's bison and head out to the basically mountain area where the reports came from, and they find basically the side of a mountain here has all these like distance markers set up, and at various points up and down the mountain there are these massive craters that look like they come from meteorite impacts, and they conclude basically that this is some sort of a targeting range where unanimity was tested. So this confirms a few things about like this is the truth of some of the information that we were presented with, but now we're getting this is what the weapon does. It's like long range, distant, and it causes giant like craters to happen. And they're like, what could it possibly be? Because they mention like, the Earth Kingdom like testing, catapults and stuff like that. So it's like, it's not that, then what? You don't really know what to think necessarily at this point. We do also get Yangchen using the avatar state in this. It's basically just to really quickly clear all, I think, the snow off the mountainside so they can see the distance markers and the craters a little bit better. But interesting chapter where like it obviously connects the investigation of Yangchen and a Unirock together, that they are actually looking into the same thing, even though it turns out that Kavik's information was wrong to a degree. But what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, this was cool just to understand sort of like this is like sort of the development area, because we know that it does have something to do with it. We just know that the information has been delayed by Kylon via Kavik here towards Yangchen here. So it's interesting to see these two paths sort of like intersect with each other here, and the whole idea that this is sort of a target range. And they mention how the firebenders use this to test their catapults and their sort of weapons that they have. So just the idea of sort of like they're developing weapons during this period of time, which we know that the nations are already on sort of like edge with each other. So that's not quite sort of like unexpected that would be doing. And the sort of idea of like the earthbenders use this for testing like their power and accuracy. They don't mention what the equivalent would be for waterbenders, but I assume it would be something similar along those lines here. But yeah, no, it's definitely cool to see how they're breaking down this sort of testing ability, and how you don't quite know, unless you're able to really good piece together, different things, what this actually is for. I don't think I figured it out at this point, what it really was. But, looking back, it seems pretty clear what, the actual things are. But I think when you're reading it the first time, it just sort of flows through. But they seem to work, together, Yangchen and Mama Unirock rather well in this here, just in terms of gathering the information here. I think they also make a mention of a note that she's used to being on an air bison, so that just leads more to the idea that they've always had someone in the temple sort of watching her to some degree. Maybe it was her herself, who knows. But it's definitely a cool setup for what comes later on.
Yeah, and I think definitely at this point, I think it's like basically impossible to figure out what it is just now. I don't think there's anywhere near like enough information, because okay, it causes craters, but who is directly at this point thinking about the like shape of like explosions in rock that combustion bending makes at this point? I don't think you're anywhere near it at this point. So for me, it was definitely the chapter we're about to discuss here where I figured it out. But after this one, it's just like, okay, I'm thinking about that in terms of what it is, but I was still on like some sort of a weapon kind of cannon long range catapult type thing, but then they directly say that here, so I'm like, I don't think it's a catapult, but who knows what. Um, so this is when we move into chapter 34, which is called Last Chances. So we see that Kavik, again, is on the ship bringing unanimity to Bin It's called the Queen of Omashu, interestingly. He still doesn't know what unanimity is, but he is so close to it. Like, literally, the idea is that, like, he's allowed to go into the room where, like, the crates are, but he obviously can't do too much rooting around because there are guards in there. There are 3 really tall, large guards in there that, as far as he's aware, are all from the Fire Nation. They're all firebenders, even though he doesn't know for sure that that's the situation. But all he knows is that the guards are basically refusing to like interact with him at all, even. So it's just kind of like, okay, there's these 3 crates in there that the weapon is inside, but what's going on? But anyway, they soon arrive at Bin and Kavik watches the unanimity being unloaded from the ship. They bring out like ropes and like they have a whole pulley system to get the big crates out. And then he just suddenly notices out of the corner of his eye a little blast of firebending aimed at the rope. And so the rope is on fire, it breaks, the crate with unanimity crashes to the ground, bursts open, and reveals a bunch of rocks. And Kavik is like reeling from this, like he has no idea what's happening here. But then he notices that, like, oh, Zongdu Hansha is just walking off with the 3 guards. Why doesn't he care that his big weapon has just been, like, found out? But that's when he figures out that, wait. Unanimity wasn't ever in the crates. Unanimity is the 3 people. It's the 3 guards, the 3 firebenders. And for me, this is where I pieced it together. I was just kind of like, this is combustion bending, isn't it? But you don't know for absolute sure that that's what it is because you haven't seen it yet, but it all seems to fit together at this point. The spherical blast craters, distance, 3 giant firebender characters. That's the only thing that can explain such a powerful weapon. So for me, this was where I figured out what it was. But I really like how it's slowly being revealed. I thought the way they did the crates opening and it just was rocks, and that until you read like a few sentences onwards, I'm kind of like, how can you turn special rocks into a weapon? But you're immediately misdirected from that. But what were your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, you are pretty much like redirected from sort of what was actually in the crates. I mean, I think they do a good job in the book of like making it seem like that's like a huge like distraction in order to get the 3 huge people away from the area and the issue that's going on. Because I mean, I think when they first get into the port, Kavik notices that like the whole situation in Ben is like completely different than when it used to be. Like the way that the people are on the docks, where all the head kickers are, just sort of the current sort of system or turmoil that's going on in Ben which is nothing like what it was when he left, which I forgot the time distance in terms of how long he's been gone, but clearly it's progressed to a point where they need all this extra muscle and security to get anything in. And I guess typically you probably wouldn't see Henshe Zongdu sort of at the docks waiting for things, but in this case, regardless of whatever else is going on, he's going to be here for this delivery here. But yeah, no, it's definitely when you see all this situation, it kind of pieces together that it's probably that is sort of what's going on here, because you don't really I guess in terms of what we know of like characters who do combustion bending, they seem to follow this sort of like standard character type, although I think later on in the book you definitely maybe get a little bit more open about what the characters actually are and how they actually interact, but do your initial I guess sort of impressions of them definitely fit that sort of mold of your standard combustion type character. But I think it's definitely a good setup in order to get them into the city, and they do it pretty quickly since they really want to get things moving at this point, and everything's just like full steam ahead at this point for the last like couple chapters of the book.
Yeah, and it's one of those ones where like I think if you're a really hardcore fan and like you've like had discussions and considered combustion bending very very heavily, you can connect it together straight away that that's what it is. But I think for maybe the average fan, it's probably still not quite enough, just because like it's a very rare ability. There are only two characters in the show. There's been no mention of like the third eye tattoo yet, which would be the real like visual signifier. But it's cool, the slow reveal here, because even in the next chapter, as we'll see, like you get another clue, and it roughly fits together, but it doesn't fully come out until the next chapter after that. So, chapter 35 here, Clarity. So, we get a little bit more of the situation in Bin Ur. Things are getting much worse in the city here. Riots basically breaking out. Lot more errand runners, head kickers in the area. Kavik realizes that he basically has to do what his brother said and sort of in a way play both sides. He's done what he's needed to do for his brother. He can now choose to bring Yangchen back into play. So he rushes to kind of get news to Yangchen about sort of what's happening here and basically make up for his misdirection. He goes to Boma to have a hawk sent down to Port Tugok, and then he rushes to find Mama Ayunarak, but finds that she's not around. He then has a bit of a kind of breakdown moment. That's just that it all comes to a head here. Just the city breaking down into chaos. The weapon is here, but he doesn't really know what's going on with it. The betrayal, people not being around, and the only thing that breaks him out of this is that this is when the explosions start. This is the noise, the massive explosion, and people start to panic in the city. He rushes back to his kind of family to be with them. This is where we get the sort of next clue of like another one of the explosions happens, and it's described as being there's like a pop pop, and then the explosion happens, which is the combustion bending sound effect. So another clue. So we then get a little bit of a kind of time skip here. It's clear that a couple of days past these explosions just keep randomly happening across the city, but they basically beat the people of the city into submission. They know that the Earth King's forces are on their way at this point. The riots are for the most part sort of quelled down because no one wants to act up when an explosion can happen like right next to you. So Kavik is just waiting with his parents when suddenly Jujinta arrives at the door. He's a changed man, and him being there confirms to Kavik that Yangchen is now in Bin Ur. And he shows that, like, hey, I have the bison whistle that you gave me, so you're still wondering, like, whoa, when did this all happen? You really have to read in depth to kind of get all the details here. But a few days have passed, and now Yangchen is here, and Jujinta was somewhat heavily involved in all of this. I like this chapter in that, like, just this mysterious, like, explosions happening. Like, Kavik has no idea what exactly it is. He seems to know what unanimity is, but, like, how on earth is he connecting the dots when he's never heard of this ability before? But what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, I think, I mean, as people who watch the show and stuff like that, like, it makes more sense to us what sort of happened, but to him as a character and to everyone else in the city, like, the idea that there's, a popping sound, if you can even hear that, but just sort of this gust of air, maybe a little bit of a smoke, and then just things exploding, that would be pretty jarring to sort of see and not have any sort of context for that at all. And the fact that they seem to be, targeted very, accurately, like they mentioned, like, sort of like the barricades that they have set up are being destroyed here, which is something that they were using to sort of control the flow in the city against sort of the Shang merchants that were trying to have things happen. That's really sort of disconcerting here. I mean, fortunately, he's able to get his note out to Yangchen ahead of time. So, working with Boma, he's able to get it out. But it really shows you sort of the state of things in here, that this is, what is having to be done in order to sort of quell sort of the rebellion, the sort of, situation that's going on in Ben-Hur here. And, it seems like everyone, pretty quickly, they sort of just like hole up in their homes here. Like Havoc has gone back with his family because of this situation, even though initially it seemed like he was trying to avoid going home just because of, the shame of everything that he had to go through. But, eventually he does actually go home here. But yeah, the idea that you do see Jujunta sort of there, and he seems to be a changed person, which is sort of interesting because they do mention earlier on that him sort of like wandering around is sort of, later on they mentioned that sort of he's sort of the roles have been flipped. So it's interesting to see. This is where you first see Jacinta come back, and he's more of like an upbeat or a positive or just, changed person here. But no, it's definitely a good one just to sort of get the idea of this sort of, crazy power that a lot of people think are like spirits. They think it's a spiritual thing that's sort of happening, and some of them just sort of like fall down on the ground just to sort of like appease whatever sort of higher power is going on in the air, which I think, in this era, it seems like a lot more people are more, I guess, sort of understanding or just sort of involved with the spirits enough that they see that that's a possible thing that could really be. Because in some times of Avatar, or from certain perspectives, it seems like people have completely like forego any idea that there are spirits in the world or that they have any sort of connection with them. So definitely not in this story, in terms of like ignoring any of those things. But yeah, no, it's definitely a lot going on in just terms of Havoc and just seeing things go to pieces.
Next chapter here, chapter 36, the display, very important chapter. So this is where everything gets fully revealed in a way. So unanimity is fully revealed to be 3 firebenders who have combustion bending. We see that this is from Hansha's perspective, this chapter. He is keeping the mystery up, and that he's purposely making it so that people don't know that the source of the explosions is 3 people, that they just keep happening basically. But to do this, it means he's been forced into this role where he's basically just looking after these 3 combustion benders, because they need to eat a lot and super regularly because it's such an energy intensive ability. So he is with the main of combustion bender of the 3, Thapa, at the moment, and Thapa is the one holding off the Earth King's army from basically entering the city. He's the most powerful in terms of the size of his explosions of the combustion benders, while it's explained that the other 2, Zhao Yun and Ying Su, are the ones keeping the riots in check and more, aiming their explosions in or around the people. They're specifically not killing anyone or really trying to hurt anyone. All of them are pretty much warning attacks, though I think the ones that are more aimed towards the Earth King's army are if you have to, take out the soldiers to stop them, it's more of do it. So yeah, he's just basically bringing them food constantly, and it really highlights the flaws in his plan. He has all of this power. It's explained he is the most powerful man on the continent, but it's a very tense situation because it's just him and 3 other people trying to hold off an entire siege force basically, and most of this is only working because they're keeping the knowledge of what's going on a secret. So Hansha talks to Thapa about where did you get this ability from? What's the deal here? Because it's revealed he doesn't know much about unanimity apart from that it exists, this is what they are, this is how you use them effectively. He knows nothing about the origins of this plan. That's more of Chaisi and Dushim's information. So he tries to ask Thapa about it. And all that Thapa really says is that, I didn't just randomly come across this ability, I wasn't given it by a spirit. It was torturous training, bitter work, and that many people drowned trying to develop this technique, which shocks Hansha, the readers, everyone. No idea what really that means. Thapa suddenly wants to negotiate the deal that they have. He's paying the 3 of the combustion benders a lot of money to do this for him. That's why they're being loyal to him. But Thoppa's kind of like, the mission's sort of changed a bit now. We're really essential to all of this. How about like 20 times the amount of money? And Hansha nearly like kind of chokes, upon hearing this insane demand. But he's basically forced to have to agree to it. Otherwise, he's done. Because if he doesn't have the combustion benders, the Earth King is going to come in. A lot of bad stuff is going to happen if he doesn't like keep this up and make it work and basically get to the negotiating table with the world leaders. Things are going very, very badly, and he's beginning to sort of lose it in all of this situation. He now decides that, okay, I'm paying you so much more. Why does it matter if we're not killing people? Go ahead. So Thoppa ends up, without even realizing, he basically targets kind of directly Kavak's house, which he and his parents are in. But as he begins to charge up the attack, he struggles to breathe and collapses, soon followed by Hansha. And then when this happens, Hansha, just as he's about to go unconscious, sees like Yangchen enter the room, Akudan enters the room, Taigum enters the room, and they basically just grab the two of them and leave. And so it's this crazy chapter where we get the full reveal of the combustion benders, but we also get like the defeat of one of the combustion benders, like the beginning of the end right as it starts. So it's a very sort of shocking and surprising chapter, but also very like intriguing, because I wasn't really sure what to expect from the whole plan, but I kind of like that they point out just how, in a way, unplanned this whole situation is. That it's not a particularly like feasible plan in the grand scheme of things. Like, we find out basically what he had sort of planned to do later, that like he had sent a message to the Earth King saying like, negotiate with me, but it all hinges on he has to keep this a secret. Otherwise, if people know that it's just 4 people, but only three of them are actually capable of causing damage, you can plan around that. It's the mystery that holds everyone back. That's a really interesting concept to all of this. But what are your thoughts on this pretty important chapter?
Yeah, no, it definitely seems like the plan wasn't fully thought out, which I think is, maybe that plays into some of Henshei's sort of character in terms of, he can see somewhat into the future in terms of goals, but he doesn't quite grasp the full situation of things, which is probably why, Chaisi didn't really want to give him unanimity, in this sort of case here, or just because of his character in general here. But no, I think you definitely do get to see a lot on sort of, just the idea of early use of, combustion benders, sort of like how Henshei sort of mentions, like he had the locations set up ahead of time for where they were going to be the best, sort of like optimize and use their sort of abilities, how some of them were better for, or Toppa specifically was better for like ranged and power, versus the other two were for more for accuracy and the speed of being able to use the ability. So it's interesting just to see sort of, with this chapter and sort of like, I guess the next chapter, sort of like, I guess sort of the techniques that they use, or the way that they're using techniques here. It makes me wonder if this is sort of just like the early development of these abilities, or if it's more, you could say like unique towards the actual characters or the actual benders and how they use it, rather than just the fact that, as far as we know, this is sort of like, the first case of us seeing this sort of ability, and how like it wasn't just sort of like a magical random chance thing that happened. Like, they had to be trained, and all of this sort of like, time and investment went into them and their abilities, which is how they, view themselves as well. Just the whole idea that, some of them have drowned, which I don't know if that comes across quite as shocking to me, but, it makes sense to me that, not everyone that would go under such a sort of, training or technique would survive it. At least that's what I consider that. But who knows what it actually means, and how many, potential more of these, benders there might be out there. But no, I think it's cool. I like the idea that, we have a little bit more to the personality of the combustion bender, since, we really haven't seen that quite as much in the Avatar world. But, here they seem to understand their worth and understand their abilities, and seemed to have already planned out that they were going to ask for, more money later on, and the whole 20x, which Henshe just immediately does the math and the calculations that he can't really afford this at all, and it probably won't start because they're just basically blackmailing him in order for their abilities. And I mean, that's kind of just like the draw of everything in general. It's just people are just making deals and making more deals and trying to come up on top. And the whole idea is like, when does it end? Does it ever end? But yeah, no, I think it's definitely a nice setup to see how they're using the ability, how right at the end here they're basically going to go off the deep end and actually hurt people directly, not just sort of like because they're in the area or anything like that. But of course there's something that comes up and it just sort of stops them straight in their tracks.
Yeah, the sort of like early aspect of the ability is actually really interesting because the big thing you get here is like Thapa is described like he has to do like 20 to 30 breaths before like an attack, and yes, they describe it that like he is the slower but more powerful one, and that I think Yingsu is the quickest one, but they still get across the idea that like they're all slower at combustion bending than either of the two that we know of, Combustion Man and Pali. So there's clearly this like kind of like inefficiency going on here, that they're like forcing the ability, and this is where the whole idea of like they don't have third eye tattoos. It would have been mentioned in the book if they did. Really interesting point. Like Thapa fires the attack and he starts rubbing at like his forehead, like trying to like open a path, as if like it's like it hurts him every time he does it almost because he has to force it through. And it's like, okay, like this is early days of combustion bending before they, I suppose, figure out that sort of like chi path chakra aspect with the tattoo. And yeah, the mention like straight away that okay, it's not just they found 3 really rare benders, but no research has gone into this. They know how to sort of draw it out. They know what type of people this ability can be found in a way, and they know how to draw it out of them. And it seems to be, again, like what way you interpret drowned. Do you directly interpret it as like they're in water and they just drown underwater, or is it like just the training was too much for them and they're using drowned in that sort of sense, that like there's too much going on or something like that? I think most people I've seen are more taking it quite literally as that meaning like drowned in water, that there's something about the technique that like it kills people when you try to like awaken it in this way. And what exactly that means, because the unique thing about combustion bending, obviously, is that like it's the only form of bending that seems to like specifically require the use of like another chakra point, basically. Obviously 4 of them are based on the elements, but the other 3, this is the only one that seems to like directly like you have to use that. If you don't have any control over the light chakra in your forehead, you just can't use the ability. It only seems to be able to be fired out of the forehead. You can't do combustion blasts with your hands or legs or anything like that. What's going on? And obviously the idea from this, connecting a lot of the pieces together, is that it seems like either some combination or one or the other, like Dushim and or Chaisi, I guess, saw combustion bending in action at some point in the past, researched the person who had it, and figured some stuff out about other likely people to have this, and have spent time, effort, money into getting more of these insanely powerful benders. So I think it implies at the very least that there's like sort of like a patient 0, the original combustion bender that they found, and that likely there are others out there, because without going too much into the rest of the book, Chaisi seems relatively fine, even though she's effectively lost 3 combustion benders. So I like a lot of the teases going forward. I don't think this is going to be a thing where we suddenly reveal like an army of like 20, 30 combustion benders, but I think there probably is another like couple out there, even if it's maybe only 1 or 2. I think there are others out there, and that probably will address the whole idea of like why it feels so like inefficient compared to others. and stuff like that. That's what makes it interesting. This is an ability that sort of like needs some explanation, and I like that they seem to be playing into that aspect as like part of the story. It's not really addressed in this book apart from this chapter, but I like that that's going to be a big thing probably in the next book. But do you have any thoughts or kind of like theories on like connecting all the pieces together, like the whole idea of like Dushim and Chaisi are the origins of Project Unanimity in the first place, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, that is an interesting idea of like, where did they see disability first? Is it something that, they just happen to come across in their travels, or is it something because of like the positions that they're in that they, were given sort of access to disabilities? I mean, from what we gather from this, story so far, it doesn't seem like any of the other world leaders are at least openly, obviously, admitting that this is something that can exist in the world, or at least as far as we can tell, the Earth Kingdom, doesn't sort of like know about this sort of ability, but who knows how that'll play out in the future. But yeah, no, I mean, I think like you said, the idea that there's at least one more who potentially either taught them the technique or was the sort of inspiration for learning this technique, even if it is in its sort of like rudimentary sort of stage currently, speaks a lot towards I guess the potential of this. But yeah, I mean, if there was like a huge amount of them, that would seem pretty like unrealistic at this point, especially with the technique not seeming to be like more perfected at this point. But no, I think it definitely, it opens a lot. I mean, I wonder, how deep we will really get into it, or if there is a lot to it in the end. I mean, it seems like, our combustion benders here do know, a fair bit about it, but they're holding it pretty close to themselves in terms of like what the actual process and the technique and all that stuff is. And, it seems like, they know their worth and how much it really is. So there's definitely a lot more to it. So I do hope it gets explained or explored a little bit more in the next book.
Next chapter, chapter 37, Exposure. So we have a lot to explain here because last chapter happened very suddenly. So we find out that Kavak was actually key in terms of like organizing a lot of this. He was the one who basically, by just tailing the right people, located where all three combustion benders were, as well as finding out at least a little bit about how the ability actually works. So effectively, because Hansha is bringing food to all of them, he just followed Hansha and found where all three of them were. And then got close to one of them enough to see like, they breathe a lot, and then when they breathe in really heavily, they do the attack. Okay, that's roughly what's going on. I can warn someone about how it works. They reveal that before the events of the previous chapter, they had already taken down Zhao Yun. So Hansha and Thapa were the second kind of trip that day. And then that leaves the chapter to focus on how do they get the last combustion bender, Ying Su, who's the one who can fire her blasts the quickest, basically. So she has realized the other two, something's happened to them, and has assumed a different defensive position in like the town hall, basically. And this is where they decide, okay, we're going to use Jujinta for this one, because we can't just use the sort of sneak up technique, because she's really, really kind of holed into this place. So Jujinta, he's a Yuyan. What they do here is that Taigum and Akudam bring him a water tribe bow, and they kind of point out the significance of this, that, he's apprehensive in a way about using it. They know he's kind of like breaking aspects of his clan's kind of culture to do this, but he will do it now, clearly because whatever interaction he had with Yangchen has changed him quite a lot. He points out that he just needs to see her for like a second or two, and then he can like take aim and fire. So someone needs to like, in a way, step out in front so he knows where she is. And that's what Yang Chen decides to do. She goes like full, I am the Avatar, you will stand down. She has to use airbending speed to avoid the combustion blast, but it's enough time where Yang Chen, because she's an airbender, senses an arrow flying through the air. And then suddenly there's silence, there's no movement, but Yang Chen at this point is right next to the window and has to make the decision. Does she do what she did with the other combustion benders to take them out or not. And what this technique is revealed to be is sucking the air out of an entire room as a way to, in this case, incapacitate people. But Yangchen is very aware that this is a technique that is, in a way, just as lethal as combustion bending, and just as important to keep out of like the public eye, because then all of a sudden people would realize that the peaceful air nomads have a deadly technique basically available to any of them who are skilled airbenders. So an interesting concept of like, one forbidden technique with another, that's how you take one out. And this is what she did to the others, was sucking the air out of the room. So what happens is that she decides, I'm not going to do it here. I haven't heard anything. So she goes inside the room. She finds Yingsu struggling with the arrow wound in kind of like her collarbone, and decides that, okay, that was the right thing to do, because if I'd sucked the air out of the room, I probably would have killed her. So she goes inside, starts to heal her. Yingsu kind of thanks her for this. So obviously the combustion benders aren't crazy. They don't want to go down fighting for this because they're only in it for the money. So at this point, at the end of this chapter, all 3 combustion benders and Hansha have been captured. Like the incident basically is over in the sense of like the siege aspect of it, but there's other stuff to be resolved. Interesting decision here that within 2 chapters, the big fight effectively happens and immediately is resolved. I like the use of the kind of forbidden airbending technique as the way to counter combustion bending, because effectively it's described as being, well, no one can really counter this ability because like you don't really notice the air leaving a room. That's the power of that technique. It is the perfect counter in a way to it. But it's interesting that they made this decision that in a way the focus of combustion bending, it's less about the fights that happen and it's more about just the information about the technique is more important than anything. And I actually really like that decision. But what are your thoughts on chapter 37?
Yeah, no, that is interesting that it is sort of like down to the technique or how you have the situation set up is the sort of best way to sort of counter combustion bending, because it has some, obviously has, some strengths and ability that it's able to use in the range and the distance. But if you are able to get in close in this case and catch the person, because it still is a person that's, combustion bending, then you have the potential to get the upper hand. So, definitely it sort of shows you that there is sort of like a leveling situation that can have with this, tremendous ability that, if other people knew about it, eventually, like all things, you would figure out some counter for it. And in this case, we can see that Yangchen is able to use her abilities, pretty quickly in order to counter this. And, I'm sure there are other ways that, they could have gone about, counter this ability. Because if you are able to get in close to a combustion bender or any other bender, or any person for that, rather, without them being unaware, any of the bending, sort of, nations or abilities can have some sort of finite lethal-ish attack that can be used on them. So there's nothing particularly I guess sort of unique in terms of that, but it is unique to see that Yangchen is using this ability and she's making such an effort in order to not have any of her other team members see this technique, see this ability, and even herself doesn't really like the idea of using this technique. But, this sort of, it goes along the lines of her just being sort of the avatar in general and just having to put away some of your, ingrained beliefs in order for, the greater good in this situation. Just in terms of how, she has to get the job done here, which is sort of goes along the lines of what, she says later on, like, you can never be, completely separate from your avatar hoodness. Like, you always have to keep that in mind. Is sort of like, along the lines of what she says to Aang here. And, she's still trying to sort of stay on the good side of things and not actually kill anyone, which I wonder if, there'll be some point where she uses the technique where she accidentally goes too far. But in these cases, she's able to sort of, either use the technique efficiently or, in the last case here, not use it because of, the situation around it where she doesn't actually need to use it and, immediately goes into actually heal the actual person who's been hurt. But no, it definitely was a cool sequence of events to see how Jujinta was actually used here, how, his abilities were perfect for this sort of situation here, how he had to sort of figure out how to use the bow. I thought that was really cool, just, to see that this was sort of like a taboo act that he had to sort of like get past because of, now he's working with the Avatar and everything, and he's able to sort of, take that into account in terms of what he's doing here. So no, I thought it was a pretty cool sequence in terms of, confronting the combustion benders and getting this all sort of, pretty quickly, like you said, in 2 chapters, just wrapping this up, which I guess, in the grand scheme of things, it's not like a huge, like, sort of like event. It's just their abilities are so overwhelming that it seems like, there might have been like a longer or more drawn out conclusion to the situation, but not in this case.
Yeah, like, I know some people like have a kind of slight issue with the book that there's no like, in a way, like notable bending fight that actually really happens in it, because in this case, like, it's sort of more like story based action rather than actual like full on fighting, because like the combustion bender's in like a defensive position, so you don't ever really get to see a proper fight happening as such, and everything else is pretty low key of like Yangchen confronts some earthbenders and just one hit like knocks them out type thing. But I like that in a way. There's sort of that acknowledgement of like fights with combustion benders always tend to go the same way. So if you're gonna have a fight, it's gonna roughly play out in the same way. So let's just do that and more highlight that the importance in this book is more about like hiding the existence of this ability and the political knowledge in a way that it is. Next chapter is called Reconciling, chapter 38. So Kavik and Yangchen talk. So they address, first of all, what's up with Jujinta and basically what happened here, how did this all come about. So Kavik gave Jujinta the bison whistle just in case Yangchen missed the letter in Port Tugok and went to Jonduri instead. So he basically had like a 2-stage plan to make sure he got in touch with Yangchen. So that's pretty much exactly what happened. Yangchen misses the letter. She arrives at Jonduri, but is drawn to Jujinta with the bison whistle, and that's where they meet. He informs Yangchen to get straight up to Bin and that's basically how it all happened. It was that meeting that changed things for Jujinta. That he mentions that there's no one like alive who can actually kind of grant me forgiveness, because he kind of notes that like the spirits don't talk to me, and I guess like his brother is dead, and that means his brother can't forgive him. So they're highlighting that, I guess, for Jujinta, Yangchen worked as a sort of like workaround for this, that he can forgive himself to a certain degree. We still don't know the exact details about it, but it's something. So Yangchen just notes that I guess, I have a new companion here in Jujinta who seems completely loyal to her at this point. Then we get around to addressing Kavik's betrayal. So he wrote this in the letter he sent down to Port Tugok, which Yangchen reveals she now has because it was brought back. So she notes that like you didn't have to put this in. You could have basically kind of gotten away with this and not revealed that you betrayed me and just said that like, oh, you were given bad information. But and it's a weird one because it's him being honest, but because she really doesn't trust him at this point, she doesn't know whether to interpret him like trying to be really honest as being trying to trick her again. Like that's how hard this really hits for her. And she just kind of gets across the idea of, because of this misinformation that Kavik has given, he has basically let information out into the world that can't really be taken back. That, as we'll get into in the coming chapters, that just the mere fact that explosions have started to happen everyone is going to start answering questions about what exactly happened here. They know what it is, and they know that if the world leaders find out about what combustion bending is, it's going to create a problem. It's borderline like this will create like a World War style problem as people want to claim these benders for themselves because they are so powerful. They note, like I think a couple of times, that this is a bending ability that rivals the power of an avatar, and the only other ability that people know of in the world on this level. And Kavik sort of let it get out there, because if he gave the right information, they could have intercepted unanimity before it ever happened and anyone ever discovered what it was. So the conclusion to this is Kavik can't be a companion anymore. She just doesn't trust him enough. For now, he'll have to just be like an asset, because basically he knows too much, so Yangchen can't just completely like ignore him. But it's literally just he's forced their relationship to be more businesslike again. And I think that this is a good chapter, because like it was like you can see how hurt Yangchen is. Like they really set this up that she trusted him so much, so the betrayal hits really hard. I feel like in book 2 they can do something to reunite them again, but they have to make it work. They can't just sort of brush it aside, because it's a big betrayal that has happened here. I like her explanation. I like that Kavik realizes that there's so much of this he maybe didn't think about in the decision that he made, but he tried to do what he could to sort of make up for it, and the problem is it just barely worked out. That's the main thing here. But what are your thoughts on chapter 38?
Yeah, it did just barely work out. I mean, I think, he was put into a hard situation here, and, he had what he thought was like, the loyalty of his family and his brother in order to potentially make the right situation here. And, I wonder, even if they did sort of stop it before it became the Ben-Ur, there's still a high chance the information would have got out to some degree. But, this is the sort of situation that they find themselves in. And Yangchen, no longer can trust Kavik with, the way that she has in the past. And she also, figures in the idea that of him coming clean can also sort of like try to get her to sort of help with his brother Kailan and sort of, and gendarmerie as well. So, there's that whole aspect of everything, in addition to, Chaisi and, the other people who do know about this ability. Like, the information loop on this is not quite as tight as she would want, as we find out more so in the next chapter. But yeah, no, their conversation here, I mean, I think on both sides you get the idea that they're not really happy with the situation that they're in here. But even more so for Yangchen, her whole thing is like trying to find, people that she can really trust, and clearly she hasn't quite had that, and especially in the last couple chapters here and everything that's been revealed. So it really does, drive a wedge in their sort of relationship here. And there definitely is a chance that they could, have some more, reconciliation in the next book, and things might be able to work back. You could potentially become back as like sort of like a true companion of the Avatar, like your standard like self-sacrifice situation. But I don't know, it also could just be that maybe they don't have that situation. Maybe he really does sort of stay with the group that approaches him at the end of the book, and that's sort of where his new loyalties lie in terms of going forward in the future, and that causes maybe even more rifts. So there's definitely a different couple avenues that they could go with their relationship, but currently it definitely is pretty strained.
Mm-hmm. From there, we go into chapter 39, the Earth King. So, very interesting chapter here. So, Yangchen has basically this secret meeting with Earth King Feishan, where they're both like in disguise. They feign this whole idea of an official meeting happening, but then they meet up in secret later on, in like the middle ring of the city. So it's the king wearing like kind of commoner's clothing out here. That's how suspicious of spies he is, that he wants to meet in secret like this to have a proper conversation. So This is where we get the idea of like Yang Chen just comes out and explains, okay, here's what happened in Bin Er. Angry spirits basically attacked the city, reacting to like the chaos that was happening in Bin Er due to the poor leadership in the city, and that was obviously the Zongdus themselves, but also she's like, you as the Earth King are also partly responsible for this, and she purposefully like threatens kind of getting him angry to kind of make the story kind of hit home a little bit more. She mentions like she's partially succeeded in calming the spirits down, but that if you take your troops out of Bin Er and let sort of me and the air nomads work, if you let me implement my plans, we can make the Shang City better than it ever was before. What she was planning to do in the first place in Bin Er. He will get more money from these great ideas and it will all work out. He does point out that like, what do you as like an air nomad know about administration? So here's where we finally see a bit of growth, and like she's just like, I don't know anything about it, but Zito does. And he's like, what? And she basically blatantly lies and says that like, oh yeah, I will contact Zito, and Zito will give all of the advice about how to manage Bin Er to maximize like profits for you. I will barely be involved. It'll be all of his advice. And he kind of after this basically agrees to it. He will withdraw his troops and let the sort of city heal and improve. And then she, right as he agrees to this, is kind of like, oh, and while you're at it, can you also maybe try and improve things in the lower ring of Bossing Say? And he's just kind of like, we'll see. Even though Yang Chen does note that he as a leader is actually like surprisingly good about like making sure that kind of like the lower ring isn't like a disaster area like it is in other eras of Avatar. So they kind of note that like, is it because he actually cares, or is it just because he doesn't want any aspect of the Earth Kingdom to come across poorly to the other nations? But if the result is that it improves things for people, she's kind of like, okay. So he's seeming relatively reasonable up to this point, but he does say he will continue to investigate the situation. He has some suspicions, including, like he mentions, he was sent a mysterious letter by Hansha, who suddenly was just like, I'm more powerful than you. We need to negotiate and come up with some plans. He does say if it turns out that basically people were responsible for what happened in Bin Er, he will act against the four nations, and he fears what he might do. So Yang Chen roughly gets what she wants, but comes out of it realizing that if she can't keep up this lie, the most like threatening, scary man in the four nations is going to basically have like a tantrum across the entire world. And we know what has happened before when something like this has happened because of the Platinum Affair. So it's kind of like she gets out of this like mostly good, but with this sort of like terrifying threat of like, can she keep the information in check and manage that? That's the big thing here. Of like, the big thing over all of this is that for how long can she keep the secret of combustion mending away from the world leaders? But yeah, after all this time, we finally get to meet the king. And what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, no, I thought it was cool to get to see the king and to see how, you know, they, even with the king, there's a bit of like the cloak and dagger in terms of like meeting and communicating with him. That whole sort of like initial idea of her being turned away was a nice way to set up their meeting, the tea shop. But yeah, I think, you know, you do get the idea that he has like sort of like the sort of commanding sort of kingly presence where he sort of like sees everything and can get a good measure of things. But, you know, he also has like, he has some, you know, idea that, you know, maybe not everything needs to be done with force directly. But, you know, it seems like he has a pretty quick terms of like sort of temper in terms of dealing with things directly. So he's really sort of, interested and wants to see results from the situation in Ben-Hur. But, he says that he does want sort of like the returns on the better situation in the city to sort of happen rather quickly. But, it seems like he does agree towards, the Avatar's sort of reasoning towards what is actually happening in the city. But yeah, you definitely see Yang Chen is just, she has like an idea and a grasp of how, he would act in the situation. So it seems like she has a pretty good measure of the situation. Now, whether, the way that she goes about things will actually work out in the end, I guess that's something that we'll see in the next book here. But it definitely seems like, she's really sort of trying to bank on this idea of being able to keep things under wrap, which, I don't know, it seems like this might almost be like sort of like not as good a plan as what Henshe was doing in terms of like keeping things under wrap. But she does seem to have at least a little bit more people supporting her, but that can only go so far, and we can see that things are already starting to sort of unravel by the end of this book here. But Yang Chen is trying to wheel and deal and keep sort of the spy thing going here. It's just sort of how long will it last?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, an important chapter in terms of just laying out some of the kind of political stuff going into the next book, that I guess Fei Shan is going to continue to be a massive threat in the background, because he's like this kind of era-defining kind of character. And it's like, yeah, success, but at what cost? Can this work? And it's just like as we go into the next chapter, Honored Guests, Yang Chen's like hands are shaking in the aftermath of this meeting, because she is aware that the Earth King deciding to take action is a terrifying prospect. Even she is aware of that, even though she was willing to sort of actually like throw a few kind of like insults in a way at the king about how he handled some of the things. She's aware that if this goes wrong, she's kind of effectively assisted almost like a world war in happening. That's how bad things are. But in this chapter, we get the idea that Yang Chen returns to the Northern Air Temple, and she considers the basically complicated political situation that she's in. She has to keep the lie about the spirits in Ben-Hur up, but to do that, that means that she has to work with the Shang merchants, not like against them, because they all have to lie about this. But it also means she can't really fully get rid of the Shangs, because it involves basically outing what unanimity actually is, which is the exact thing she doesn't want to do. This is also the exact reason that she can't do anything against Zhongdu Chai-Si, because again, the only information she has over her is that, hey, you're the one doing the unanimity thing, but again, no one can know about that. So Chai-Si sends Yang Chen a letter of just saying, like, basically, good move to basically make the decision to not do anything. So there's this sense where Yang Chen just sort of feels powerlessness, even though she's done everything possible to try and make this situation work out for the best. She's stuck in this position where she can't really do anything right now, because the information she has is the information she needs to keep secret, and all these other sort of situations. And it gets kind of brought up that like that more or less means Kalyan probably also can't be touched, but he's going to be probably on the run from Chai-Si. So there's just a minor mention that he probably kind of gets away in all of this. And when she arrives at the air temple, the abbot, Sonam, is pretty angry at her, because it's revealed here that where she's holding the three combustion benders as well as Hansha is basically at the Northern Air Temple. They're keeping them all prisoner. It's revealed that like each combustion bender has like 6 master airbenders around them at all times, just in case anything like happens. Hansha, of course, isn't much of a physical threat, so he's just basically kept in a room in the temple. She hasn't been able to get any information out of the combustion benders. They, pretty much like they are with Hansha, they don't say anything. They're aware of the uniqueness of their powers and the position that they're in. that they seem somewhat confident that they'll get out of this situation eventually and can benefit from something happening in the future. So she wants to know about them. She has all the same questions that everyone has, but she's not getting any answers. So the combustion benders are more or less treating this as a little bit of a like vacation, because they're not being treated harshly by the airbenders, but they just know they can't be like, you know, free at this point. The abbot does worry about, like, not necessarily that Yangchen has asked them to do this, but more that if this lasts for a long time, that it might have an influence on the air nomads, that they've watched over people, they've held power over other people. What might that do to them? And it's, I think, more suggesting like this might lead to a greater change in like the philosophy of different groups of air nomads. When otherwise this is a pretty united era for the air nomads. Yangchen then heads to the Avatar's room, which he rarely goes to, and considers basically like kind of giving up, stopping her kind of trademark philosophy of like being as active as possible. What if she were to just stop doing that and kind of just do the bare minimum of what's expected to be the Avatar? Fully embrace being an air nomad Avatar, like a negative Jing, and just basically not rush out to help anyone necessarily, but also in doing that not lead to anything bad happening. What if that were to be what she does going forward, like many would maybe suggest her to do? And just as she's about to kind of almost make that decision, because she considers, well, if I did that, I'd have time to look for Jetson. The abbot comes back and basically says, oh, remember the woman you healed with Kavik from before? We found her missing son. It's a major success. It's all because of you and Kavik that this happened. So this small little success of like she's actually succeeded at something is just enough to keep Yangchen from like quitting. Even though she's aware that in continuing to go on, it's this difficult and tough road that will probably lead to more suffering than anything else. It's I think it's meant to reference some of the advice that she gives to Kyoshi at the end of Shadow of Kyoshi. But the idea here is that she will go to visit the woman like in the morning. For now, she will sleep, and she actually sleeps peacefully for like one of the first times in a long time, because little something has happened that's gone her way, that it's just enough to keep her going. I like this chapter. Obviously, it's teasing a lot of stuff for the next book. This is the political situation that we're roughly going to be in, probably at the start of the next book. All the world leaders, keep it a secret from them. The Shangs are still going to be a threat to some degree, because she can't fully remove them from power, because of the information. And then, yeah, they're all but teasing the idea that the combustion benders will escape at some point. We don't know how, but that they'll come back into play in some way. So what are your thoughts on this chapter here?
Yeah, I think the idea that she's struggling with this, I think that's a very sort of like real and pertinent sort of situation to bring up here after everything that she's been through, because there's been a lot of sort of like, you know, ups and downs, and, you know, she's been, you know, confronted at different situations of what she's actually been doing and if it's the right way to go about doing things. So I like that her character has this sort of like, you know, conscious of like, you know, a fate here where she really sort of, you know, questions if everything that she's done has been sort of the right direction, or, you know, if it's the way that she really wants to go about doing things. So I like that, you know, it sort of ended with the note that, you know, despite everything, she did have this sort of one positive thing, even if she did it with a person that she doesn't quite, you know, trust and want to think about too much anymore. You know, things did sort of turn out well. But yeah, you definitely can see that there are a lot of sort of like moving pieces here that need to be resolved with, you know, Chicey and everything with that city, and just her knowledge, which, you know, pretty much puts her in a position where, you know, even if she doesn't have the assets and unanimity anymore, she still has, you know, the information on them and how, you know, to use them, and, you know, the current combustion benders and sort of them being in sort of like, you know, forced lockdown here, and the air nomads that are having to sort of like in rotating shifts, they say, like, watch over them, and they were picked because of their sort of like martial prowess. So there's the whole idea of just airbenders doing things that typical airbenders don't do, which is what she has to do as an avatar, but getting other air nomads to do that might not necessarily be the best way to go about it. And I mean, we know sort of the future with everything with Aang's time and everything, that they don't quite exist that long, so they're whatever change does happen to them, if there is any, doesn't exist going forward, but maybe that influence some of the reasoning and logic of the other nations in the future to come. Who knows per se what they're going to do with that? But no, there's a good bit of a setup here for the next book and what's going to come.
Yeah, because like the main thing I think we know about the airbenders from like eras to come is just that like in the Kyoshi era they're nowhere near as spiritual as they are the Yangchen era, because like Khalsang was borderline like almost considered to be a liar for saying that he went to the spirit world, when in this book it seems like at least 3 or 4 nuns at the Western Temple can meditate into the spirit world if needed. So something pretty drastic kind of happens there. And then in the Roku era, you have the whole like guiding wind sort of like splinter group of airbenders as well. So this might be like a setup of maybe like that side of things, like a little bit.
Yeah.
But we'll have to wait and see if they do anything with it. Like, did you interpret that as more of like a long-term thing, or more like direct setup that like, in a way, like what if the combustion benders, who are sort of crafty and business-like themselves, what if they try to influence the people watching over them? Like, is this a long-term or a short-term kind of like setup that Sonam's worries?
No, that's a good point. I don't know if I fully considered that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Tapa, he seems to be the one that we've interacted with the most, and he might be able to have some interactions or some sway like that, but I don't know. I don't see that quite as much happening, considering they're trying to keep them more on the guard, so letting them sort of be influenced in that sort of way doesn't quite seem as likely to me. It seems to be, I would think that maybe it might be more sort of a long-term thing, or just sort of, a gradual influence, since I think they mentioned that some of these air nomads that are watching them are rather younger, so maybe they're being influenced in that sort of way, just in terms of their actual actions and what they do. But yeah, no, I mean, there's definitely a lot that could happen, over the time, over the next, avatar or so, in terms of the tweaking of how the air nomads actually interact with the world at large, or at least some groups of them.
Yeah, because the other setup here seems to be that this is also Yangchen like bringing the air nomads into what is otherwise like a kind of 3-nation political issue. That like before this, it seems like they're free. They're allowed to pretty much do what they were doing before the Platinum Affair, but we were already referencing this, I think, in the chapter where she brings Kavik to the hospital, and the abbot is kind of like, you can't be doing your spy stuff in like an air nomad hospital. What if the other nations find out? What if the other nations find out that like the combustion benders are being kept prisoners by the air nomads? That would suddenly bring them into the Water Tribe Fire Nation Earth Kingdom conflict, and their travel rights might be revoked, and this kind of brings them into things in that way, where they've otherwise had like a kind of free pass. That would be an interesting sort of like failing on Yang Chen's part, if like she ended up sort of like losing the air nomads kind of some of their like kind of privilege in the world in a way. In that it probably means she kind of has to find like another place to keep them that doesn't immediately come across as like it's an air nomad kind of prison. That's like the first thing, just so she doesn't involve her nation in it directly. Because they're pretty much saying the other nations will find out about this. It's only a matter of time, so something has to happen soon. And the end of this chapter is basically Yang Chen being like, okay, I have to put the effort in, but I think I have some plans. I think I know what to do. And we have to wait and see what exactly that is. But last chapter of the book, chapter 41, the epilogue, it's from Kavak's perspective, and we see that things have drastically improved in Bin The Earth Kingdom's forces have withdrawn. There's a lot of air nomads around. People are quite liking this. Yangchen is kind of like this legendary figure in Bin at this point. Like, she feels like the legend from like the Kyoshi era in this town, like already at this point. But it's obviously this weird thing for Kavak where suddenly he's watching Yangchen and her like companions, associates kind of doing things from afar. He's not included in that stuff anymore, and he's aware that it's his own actions that mean he's not involved in it. But he sort of maybe felt like he might have been minorly still associated with it, so there's a slight sense of disappointment there. But he soon realizes that he's being followed by a waterbender. So he tries to escape through the alleyways of Bin he tries to escape with like a water ladder, but it gets water bent like to break it. And it looks like Kavak is about to be sort of like killed / captured, more likely, when suddenly Mama Ayunarak appears behind the guy, knocks him out with some sort of a tool or device, and she reveals that the guy who was trying to capture him was a Thin Claw sent by the Chief of the North, Oilurk, and that they're basically after him because he knows about unanimity. And Ayunarak, the book ends with basically, I think it's time you joined our group. So it's effectively Kavak joining the Order of the White Lotus as the kind of cliffhanger ending to the book. So directly confirming that, like, just because like he's not Yangchen's companion anymore doesn't mean he'll just be sort of like abandoned in the next book. He's still going to have a pretty notable plot, but it's with the Order of the White Lotus, and there's a lot of questions surrounding this. But this is obviously confirming a few things that, like, okay, we know the Earth King is going to still continue to investigate what happened in Bin Here directly is the Northern Water Tribe chief investigating Bin because he sent basically one of his like elite unit into Bin to find one of the guys associated with it, and obviously the Fire Lord is going to obviously have his people as well. So what they thought was going to happen is happening. Kavak needs to be, protected, and there's a few questions you have here of like, is he being brought into the Order of the White Lotus just to be protected by them, or do they actually see him as being a good potential Lotus? And what's that going to do for him if he finds out like the truth or not? Because it'll be a huge positive if they actually truly want him. It'll be a little bit of a blow if it's again just because of the information you have. But an interesting setup. Ayunarak, I guess, is going to be a major player in the next book. Kavak still will be, and just that's good to know. More Order of the White Lotus stuff. But what are your thoughts on the final chapter of the book?
Yeah, definitely more Order to White Lotus stuff is always good to see that sort of set up there with Kavak and Mama Ayunarak and how they're going to be, involved with the whole sort of issue. I mean, there's a lot that could happen there in terms of working with Yangchen, and maybe that's sort of going to be the way that she finally gets like the support that she needs that we were talking about earlier, that maybe in order to not involve, her nation as much. But no, I like that, Kavak is still going to be involved, even if currently he's pretty much at like a really sort of like a low point. Like, he's being sort of exiled from like the action and everything that he was involved in, everything that he helped or not helped directly. But I think it's a good segue into sort of the conclusion of everything, hopefully in the next book.
And I suppose on those events, like, do you think there's any sort of like, is Ayunarak working with Yangchen here? Has she like brought him in on Yangchen's orders, or is this like completely separate? Because we never got a scene covering like Ayunarak and Yangchen like parting ways or anything like that, and what's going on here, because she's obviously back in Bin but she wasn't involved in the takedown of the combustion bender, so we don't know if like they're on much better terms now or not, and what exactly Yangchen sort of using Kavak as an asset means when she hasn't like talked to him since. So like, did you see any of those connections here, or is this just Ayunarak acting on her own?
I mean, I think it would be cool if Yangchen was working with their Unirect, but it seems like Yangchen has, even if she's willing to like, work with them on certain regards, like she doesn't really want to be involved with the organization. So I would be surprised if this was like her doing, especially with how she feels about Kavik right now. Like that seems like something that she wouldn't really want to involve herself in. But I know it is curious why they are approaching Kavik. Like, has she seen something in him this whole time, which is why, she knows, a good bit about him, or is it like you said, like for the like information that he knows, and again, what is Kevin going to do? Like, is he going to like betray the trust again to the Order of the White Lotus, and that's going to be another blow to Yang Shen? No, there's a lot that could be
Hmm.
there.
And then yeah, like that is the end of the book, and what is interesting is that like very little is resolved. The only thing that really got resolved in the book is just the Hansha situation, effectively. Like we sort of roughly resolved the events of Bin in terms of Yang Chen eventually got what she wanted, which is that she has improved things in Bin but there's still the truth about what happened sort of lingering over all of this, which could put it completely back. Because obviously we know going forward we don't know anything about Shang City, so they go away eventually. Something happens, and are we going to see that in the next book? And what exactly happens? Is it because of like Feishan like attacking like the entire world or whatever? Um, or what if the three feuding nations just make up and agree to trade normally? That would lead to the Shang cities going away in a kind of like just a reverse of the Platinum Affair type situation. Is that possible? Um, and that would be an interesting one where Yang Chen is kind of like, I don't think we need to full on get rid of these cities because there is that slight sense, as we pointed out before, that
Mm,
it is the nations sort of coming together to create something that's kind of good. And what if just the nations actually reforming better relations ruins that? Um, there's a few interesting ways that they could do this because obviously combustion benders remain a bit of a mystery in the world. So just from what happens over the course of the eras is that obviously this project with the combustion benders gets shut down eventually, but there are still traces of it in the world. But we go from I suppose a situation where we theoretically have like say five or so combustion benders in the world to one an era. Like there's a lot that kind of has to happen in this book, I think, to resolve some of those kind of like bigger aspects. And like as people have pointed out, like there's a lot of things in play here. We have uh, the Earth King is like a major character. The the Water Tribe chief seems to also be quite in play. And I'm guessing if the information is actually going to get out there, the Fire Lord is going to obviously want to claim these people as one of his own. So three world leaders, Chicey, um, and then you obviously still have like the Zongdu of Port Tugok out there. If there's anything to that character, and then there's the last Shang City, which we didn't really touch on like at all, Taku, which is actually the one place that we seem to know book two will actually focus on, but we don't know what the full situation with that actually is. Then add in the fact that there's the Jetson stuff. They're going to have to do something with Kalyan, and there's a lot to cover in the next book. And I wonder how they're going to do it. Like, is the book going to be like all resolution, or what? So where are you at like the end of this book in terms of like we are going into a book with like a million things set up?
yeah, no, it does feel like that when you sort of lay it out. I mean, I think some of them can overlap, so they don't necessarily have to be resolved individually. But there are a couple of different pieces there that have the potential for some huge like outcomes, like just the fact that all the three world leaders are vying for this information could in theory potentially lead to another world war. Like they sort of starved off the one dealing with the Platinum Affair through this sort of like setup and sort of forced isolation except for these specific cities. But it definitely feels like this could actually lead to like a proper, drawn out battle, which, I mean, depending on how you view things from what we know in history so far, assuming stuff hasn't been like completely brushed under the rug, it probably doesn't go that far, but there's still a lot of like under the table stuff that could happen here. So no, I think it's definitely, a lot of different situations here that could be resolved. And some of them, I think we can see maybe potential ways of how they can be resolved kind of like quietly. But no, I think it's definitely pretty cool to see that there is a lot of different options here that they could go with the story. So I don't know. I think they definitely can do it in the next book. It just depends on how much of them they sort of intertwine together, and if some, say like the other cities, are as important as they might be, or is it really just sort of like Ben-Ur and Jandari, and maybe Taku is sort of like important towards this sort of political situation that's going on right now.
Yeah, because like there's a few ones where you kind of feel like, okay, they've made a big deal about like Yangchen needs time to do the Jetson thing, so that either, I guess, has to happen maybe like off screen, resolved at the start of the book, or will be our kind of like epilogue type thing that after she finally resolves the plot, she finally has time to do that, and that's our ending point in the book. That instead of getting like a emotional past life scene, we get the emotional Jetson scene. I think that probably will be why they do that one, because I feel like it has to be somewhat separate. Kalyan, I think, is very interesting because I think they'll find some way to incorporate him into things that, like, maybe he turns up in like Taku in like the same position that he was in like in Janduri, but he's safer there or something like that. I feel like they're making the point that like he's gone down this path, and even though he kind of has the out now to like hide and stay away from this line of work, I get the feeling he'll probably turn up again doing something like that. But there was an interesting theory that I saw that was, I feel, is kind of interesting, of like, what if Kalyan is like the father of Chaisi's child? And I thought like, it was very dramatic. I didn't believe it initially, but then I started thinking like that could like work as a way to resolve the whole situation of like Chaisi was in on it the whole time. She acted like she didn't want unanimity to get out, but ultimately she allowed Kalyan to let it get out, because they are actually quite close. And because ultimately what happens here, we don't know where Kalyan is. Hansha's been captured and Chaisi's in a good position. That's an interesting idea, because otherwise she's pregnant for a reason. They're doing something with that. So it either has to be the father doesn't matter and it's just the next stage of her like dynasty on Janduri. The child will be a potential combustion bender, or the father is someone like of note. What are your thoughts on that? Like, where do you think they're going with the whole Chaisi pregnancy thing? It maybe suggests the time skip between the books, but what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I wonder about the time skip, or how long the time skip really would be if they went that sort of route. But I don't know. I think that they definitely, I definitely could see how that could potentially work. Like, Kailan was just sort of like, he's just sort of like a double plant or whatever. I mean, the way that the book goes back and forth about people and their loyalties and stuff like that, I guess that wouldn't be too surprising if that actually came to be. So no, I think that has potential to actually work. I mean, I do wonder how. No, I guess not. It totally could work. I mean, I think it's just a situation to keep our characters sort of involved, and sort of they knew all the time, and maybe that's why, just another reason why Kavik was able to sort of like be as good as he, thought he was, but maybe he really wasn't in the end.
And then there's even smaller things like they didn't say what really happened with Jujinta's brother. That feels like a little thing they could add in at some point, because we assume Jujinta will make an appearance in the next book. They said he was a companion, but does that mean like Kavik like a companion, or more like a Taiyagum Akudan style kind of companion? We have to wait and see, of course, on that. But and then there's also, I suppose, maybe a slight sense of like, will they do she talks to Zito and has a bit more of an emotional conversation about things, and like he addresses like what his flaws were, so she feels a bit better about her situation. So yeah, I guess do you think they'll do more with the whole Yangchen gift and address stuff with the past lives in her in the next book?
I wonder about that. I mean, it seems like she did a lot, obviously she did dozens and dozens and dozens, right? So like she's already done quite a bit of talking with them. So I don't know. It doesn't seem like she's that key, even though she's willing to use Zito's, name and his abilities or the sort of, recognition of his abilities in order to further her own ends. But it really seems like they're trying to focus on the idea that, the past avatars, despite, them knowing what they knew then, it doesn't really come into play as much in the current times. So I don't know. I mean, I think, I'm sure they'll still throw in there, her having her issues with her gifts, and, maybe it'll be some one or two instances where that really sort of affects her in some sort of like direct manner. But, I can't see them like playing it too much in terms of what she's having to do with it. Although, I mean, I'm sure they could really work it in if they want to, but like she seems to be set that they can't help her in her current situation. So I don't know how much, how importance that would have to her actual situation in the here and now.
And I suppose the final thing is just, I suppose, the scope and depth of how much they actually go into combustion bending. Because I think coming out of this book, that's the main thing I think fans want to see, is just, you've teased it and teased it. You said the drowned thing. It's like a research project. It feels like you need to have a little bit of a backstory with Chai-Si to explain how she came across combustion bending, to even know to set up this research stuff. And then maybe, I don't know if they'll go super technical on it, but just a little bit more insight into the nature of the technique, and explain why drowning is apparently a way to unlock the ability and stuff like that. Because there's a few things with Chai-Si, like the whole, like she mentioned, she's from like an unknown island, like in between the Earth Kingdom and the Fire Nation, and there's clearly some sense that like the combustion benders come from like a random fire island or something like that. So you can maybe see a few ideas for how this kind of comes about, but I'd like to see the details of it, because obviously Yanchen's trying to keep it secret, but she'll eventually probably want to shut down the project. So Chai-Si, we assume, will be in the book in a way like that. How in depth do you think they're going to get with the full combustion bending explanation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't expect any like sort of like super technical or anything along those lines, but I think, having the history of it to some regard, even if it's just sort of how Chai-Si sort of figured out the technique, is it from, her island where she's from, or is it just something that she came across with the other Zongdu from previous time? I think it's, I could see it having like, maybe a chapter or half a chapter in terms of just like history, in terms of how, its function, or how it sort of came to be in its current state. Like maybe not like, the deep lore origins or anything along those lines, but just sort of how it's currently being functioned and used, and how, it doesn't really, how the secret is sort of kept under wraps in sort of the long term, since we know it doesn't really get out there in any current substantial way, at least as far as we know.
And so, yeah, I guess we'll just end with some kind of final thoughts here on the book. So, the book's been out kind of quite a while now, nearly an entire month. What are your thoughts? Where do you stand on the book now after having a few weeks to like fully digest it?
Yeah, no, I thought it was really good. I think, it's definitely a different sort of style and flavor than the previous book with Kiyoshi. But I think, for the first one of this Avatar, sort of getting into a nitty gritty of, a particular incident that they had to involve with, it turned out pretty well. I mean, I think it definitely has a different way that it goes about telling the story. It may not be as sort of, bend-in focus or action focus, but I think it still has a lot of intrigue intrigue and a lot of, Avatar world bending into it, that it still makes it a enjoyable read. It's not, necessarily a hard read or anything like that. Like, you can get through it pretty quickly, but it still adds to the overall world, to the experience, and to, an Avatar that, we really only knew a little bit about, and it definitely fleshes out their character a lot more than we probably otherwise would have got in pretty much any other form, unless they really dedicated time to her character.
Yeah, like I've had quite a while to like digest the book since I got it so early, but I really really like it. Like even after like all these weeks, all these videos, podcasts talking about it, it's still really really interesting. And like you say, it's different than the Kyoshi books. The Kyoshi books have sort of more of a kind of personal drama sense to them, because there's a lot more going on with just the sort of mysteries of Kyoshi herself as she kind of discovers she's the Avatar, and the events sort of happen, whereas this is an Avatar who's very capable, trying to get something done, and in many ways that's the more unique story that we haven't really seen all that much. And I like that we're not dealing with like an Avatar who is just struggling to deal with world leaders, or doesn't like is still in training or something like that. I like that Yangchen knows what to do. It's tough to do stuff, and that's a major part of the plot. And I appreciated that they did give quite a bit of the book to Kavik, because I think you needed like another notable main character in the book, because Yangchen doesn't have like necessarily all that other personal kind of stuff like Kyoshi had. I'm not sure you would have quite been able to do it without having like a really really strong kind of support character with her. So I think Kavik worked out really well, and the kind of dual main character thing was good, because now we go into the next book with this thing of this amazing potential Avatar and their companion dynamic, and we want to know, will it happen again? Will they get back together, work on missions together, or is it done because of the events of this first book? It's more political, but I don't think it's like boring political. I think it's very interesting with the whole Shang merchant stuff, and they have an amazing reveal with the combustion bending that again sets up things really well for the next book. And I think if it even delivers on like a handful of those plots in book 2, I think the Yangchen kind of books as a duo will feel like much more like in line, like a real kind of thing of like, which do I prefer, this one or this one? Whereas I think the general consensus so far has been that like, I think most people still really like this book, but that there's a general leaning towards the Kyoshi books as being the kind of preferred ones right now. But if the reveals are amazing in the next Yangchen book, it could definitely come up. So it's 3 out of 3 for books for me, and I'm excited for the next one, definitely. So yeah, that's been it. That is it for episode 250 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.